Christianity what the Romans did to Greek culture and really,
Yes.
you know, this Romanization that occurs.
Let us simplify it for consumption by the masses and
Well,
as a
it
tool of empire.
seems like the Romans are the real enduring archetype that the levers of power and control can be exercised regardless of sort of the underlying layer. You
Yes.
know, oh, we need to control Greek culture. Fine. We'll control early Christianity. Fine. We'll control whatever. You know?
Donald, the important thing is to love it.
Love and fear. Because as we all know,
Yes.
true love involves fear.
Don't knock it until you've looked it over. Yeah? Don't dismiss it.
Yeah.
Uh,
Learn
resistance
to
is
be
futile.
it.
I will be assimilated.
Yeah.
Thank you, Donna.
Yeah. It really changed my understanding of ancient history when I first encountered Kenneth accusing the Roman Empire of being the mafia of the classical world. You know,
The mafia of the modern world and probably the mafia of the future world.
the, the basic thing, you know. One of the best books for learning Latin is called Familia Romana, and it's entirely in Latin. There's not a word of English in it. It just starts with very simple Latin. It's got pictures, on the sides and the margins, and you can figure out what it's saying. You start with simple sentences and work your way up. It's really a genius piece of construction. But it's not until the second chapter that you start to understand that the word familia in Latin does not mean family. You would think that it does, because I mean it's right there. It's got almost all the letters in common. But no, it means your household as a whole, including all your slaves. They're part of your familia. Your familia is the mafia equivalent of, hey, this is our thing. We got our thing going, and hey, you're with us now. There won't be any leaving. Oh, come on, you can't go. And that was what was meant by the Romans, by familia. It's like, yeah, there's the people we're directly related to, and then there's all the ones we've enslaved who are not able to leave. And it's boy, that the mafia connection Kenneth Smith made for me just comes home, because these Latin teachers are not interested in promulgating existentialist philosophy. They don't share Kenneth's point of view. They're just trying to give you the definitions of the words, and there's just no avoiding the fact that to the Romans, familia meant, you have I try to leave, but they pull me back in. The Godfather, Hi, Jenny.
Hi, Rick. I was reading a little bit for a change, bad girl that I am. And I'm thinking, oh my God, Kenneth and oh, you're right on, Kenneth. I mean, where was I? I should have been reading all along. Naughty girl that I am. Anyway, so it was, yeah, he's right on, baby. Um,
Yeah, he doesn't mince words in these paragraphs we're
no,
in right now.
no. I mean, he just, boy, right on target. Um,
Can I just say that because nothing is 100%, and while what David says is predominantly true, there are some churches, very few of them, and they're hard to find, that operate within the confines of the faith itself.
Yes, yes. And we're going to be talking about that, uh, including today, when we're gonna talk about Q, the lost gospel, the one that Matthew and Luke based their writing on. They based it partly on Mark and they based it partly on Q. And we have Mark, but we don't have Q. but scholars have been able to reconstruct what Q must have said. And we're going to talk about that today. And you're going to see really initially nothing about heaven and hell, and everything is about being a good person.
Yeah, this might amuse you. I was looking at a video on a guy was talking about Heidegger. It's interesting to see that Heidegger regarded himself as the great one of the next few thousand years. And he was rather critical of Nietzsche and Spengler.
Yes, I bet.
And the guy was saying he's looking at his regard for Nietzsche and Spengler was on the level of Dumb and Dumber.
Yeah. It's one of the ways that you can learn how ideology operates in human beings is you watch people who are otherwise brilliant and thoughtful and open to ideas, but when something starts to cross their core ideology, all of a sudden their arguments become juvenile and just very thumb on the scale, pressing hard to try to get the outcome they want. And you look at that and you think, how could the same person who wrote this beautiful, nuanced stuff over here be writing this dumb propaganda stuff over there? And the answer is he can't tell he's doing it, right? The ideology warps his understanding of the world. You cross the lines of his ideology, and he can't help himself. He has to try to defend the truth that he knows is the truth.
Rick, I have a question for you. I know maybe you've already said this many times and I just didn't hear. How did you discover Kenneth Smith? I've been going to a lot of meetings
Comic books,
and people don't talk about Kenneth Smith. How did you discover him?
comic books. I
I'm
discovered
sorry, did you say comic book?
I said comic books. I discovered him because I was into reading comic books, and but I was reasonably smart even though I was young, and so I wanted to read interesting discussion of comic books, not could Superman beat the Hulk kind of stuff, but I wanted to read about the writers and the artists and the editors and what was the process of creating this and what were how could comics be used other than superheroes, like comics used to tell about the Holocaust or comics used to teach about what it's like to live in poverty. And so I ended up getting hooked on a magazine called the Comics Journal. And the
So you
comics,
were like just a like elementary school
oh no,
kid?
much later, much later. This is in
Oh,
my
oh, oh,
20s,
okay, okay,
my 20s.
okay.
So I'm collecting comics and I'm subscribing to the Comics Journal. And weirdly, in the back of the Comics Journal is this little column with abstruse writing that people keep writing in the letters column going, why do you publish this? This is horrible. Why is this in here? So I start reading it, trying to figure out why is this in here? What does this have to do with comics? And the answer is the publisher of the Comics Journal, his name was Gary Groth. And Gary Groth, was concerned about excellence. And Kenneth Smith was concerned about excellence. And Gary Groth, knew Kenneth Smith because of that connection. And so he allowed him to be in the back. Also, Kenneth Smith had made some philosophical comic books, The Age of Reptiles, The Age of Insects, and so on. And so that was sort of justified Gary Groth including it at the back of each issue. So the more I read of it, and the first column I read of his, which I think was the same one that David Roel first read, was Dramas of the Mind. The more I read of it, the more I thought, this guy's good. this guy can write. His command of English is better than mine. His command of the subject matter is better than mine. And eventually, he had it. He always, in return for putting the column in, he was allowed to have a one-page advertisement because he sold books. And so it'd be, here's all my book sales. Here's how you reach me. Here's my email. Here's my phone number. So one day I just called him up. I was like, I gotta talk to this guy. And that was,
Well, I mean, I've know a lot of people who've gone to UT Austin. I mean, my sister did her nursing degree from UT Austin in the 70s, and my brother-in-law was an anesthesiologist. I'm sure he did UT. So, but they're in nursing and medicine. So, but I have to ask them, do you know Kenneth Smith? Have you ever heard of him? I'm now
yeah.
curious. Paul von Hippel, who's a professor in UT Public Policy Department for many, many years. So anyway, I have to start mentioning Kenneth Smith in my conversations with my
Yeah.
family.
Well, in the late 60s, early 70s, or till about 1970, Kenneth was at Yale getting his PhD.
Oh,
So
Yale. Uh-huh.
he got his doctorate at Yale, not at UT. And
But
so,
he taught at UT for many, many years, right?
no,
Oh, I thought he taught at
I
UT.
don't think he taught at UT.
I can't remember which tech. He taught it at Texas
He
University.
taught at the University of Dallas, I
That's the
think,
one.
and some other.
Why did I think that he? Oh,
He does have his undergraduate degree is from University of Texas, and he lives in Austin. He lived in he might have been born there. I don't know where and I didn't know him then, but
oh, I see. Because I know my sister and my sister has lived in Austin since 1970s. Again,
Yeah.
you know, they still live there.
yeah, from about 1970 to 80, he was at LSU in Baton Rouge, and then left there and went to Dallas.
Yeah.
I'm kind of hazy on the date. It's all 50 years ago, Jenny. I
Yeah.
apologize, but
In fact, I'm going to Austin in a couple of weeks for Christmas to be with my sister and family. So I'll bring up Kenneth Smith.
oh,
You should visit him.
you should yeah, you
Oh, I
can
should visit
visit.
You
him.
should
Oh, yeah,
visit
like he's going
him.
to, yeah, like he's going to let me come into, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if there is sometimes a problem actually going into his house.
That's why you should visit him.
What area of Austin does he live? My sister
He
lives
lives in the northwest part of
Northwest. My sister lives in Barton Creek neighborhood. I don't know if you know that neighborhood. Barton
No,
Creek Country
I
Club.
know if you
Yeah.
come up from Houston or come in from I-10, I get off of I-10 the other side of San Antonio and then go across through Fredericksburg and whatever, and then into Austin. That he lives at about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock up on the northwest side. You sort of he lives kind of outside the ring road that's kind of there.
Anywhere near the Austin airport these days? No,
I don't know where. I've never flown to Austin, so.
Oh, you have? Okay.
So Jenny, when is
but
this
I
trip?
hardly recognize Austin. I hadn't been to. I saw him this last summer
Oh, you did?
in Austin, and I didn't recognize. I mean, I almost, I got his address. I pulled it up on Google Maps. I got Street View, and I said, that's not his house. But it was his house, but his house had been sort of in a brand new neighborhood on the prairie, nothing higher than maybe.
I mean, I've been going to Austin
grass.
since 1970s, like I said. And 1970s Austin and Austin today is completely different. It's like Austin now is like New York City or whatever large city. In the 70s, Austin was like some small southern town almost, very quaint.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, his house originally was way out, and now it's not out.
Yeah.
And the neighborhood's got trees and stuff, and if it hadn't have been for GPS, I would not have found him.
So Jenny, when's your trip?
I'm leaving on 18th.
Yeah,
18th through 28th. Yeah.
We've got time to arrange it if you want to visit him. He would enjoy it. And you would see that Donald and David and I are not exaggerating when we say that he turns his house into a labyrinth. All the bookshelves.
Really?
Just so many bookshelves.
Well,
oh my God.
He needs a lot of storage. You can't have internal storage. It's just like a computer. It's not all internal storage. Some things have to be stored externally. And so he probably has 10 or 12 tons of books.
Well, another meeting that I go to, Eric Christensen from Chicago, he's 40 years old. And early in the game, a couple of years ago, he showed me his library. He has entire room full of bookshelves from floor to ceiling of library books. And he would say, oh, this is my Kierkegaard shelf. This is my Kant shelf, And he's in software engineering, but his love of philosophy is amazing, and his just knowledge of philosophy is also amazing.
Yeah.
And that's the COVID, the silver lining to COVID is like meeting all these super intelligent people in this Zoom land. And Rick, you're absolutely one of those, right?
Does he
Oh, stop it.
does he have bookshelves up both sides of the stairways? I mean, Kenneth has more
Well,
stuff,
like
books.
I said, Eric is 40 years old. By the time he's 60, who knows how many books he'll have
Yeah,
by then.
Kenneth is now about 80, so yeah, he's
Oh,
had
okay.
plenty of. But this is the second house he's.
Yes. Yes.
Well,
When
actually,
I visited him, he was in Duncanville.
yeah, and his house in Baton Rouge. I think the children still, yeah, his children still lived at home
Oh,
when
he's
he
from
was.
New Orleans. He also.
No, he didn't. He never. I don't know that he lived in New
Oh,
Orleans, but
Baton
he
Rouge,
lived in.
Louisiana. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and his house there. He had young children, and I think their bedrooms didn't get consumed by like the public spaces. But it's you just go and you see, oh, what where did how you have a copy of that title? You can't get that anymore, stuff. He has an amazing collection. Of course he buys and sells too.
He sells books.
Oh, yeah, he's a bookseller. So you
Oh,
should, when you visit him, you can ask him for recommendations.
Yeah. What would you like to read about? And he can offer up a box of books.
whoopee doopie. Yeah,
He
like.
sold me a box when
Yeah.
I was visiting.
Yeah.
I've always bought books from him.
Oh, yeah, me too.
Things that I can't,
Wait a minute,
one,
Rick.
it's helpful to him.
You mean he would sell books to you and then mail them to you, or like?
Oh, I was driving, so he just put them in a cardboard box, and I just put them in my car. So
I was flying, so he mailed them to my home.
yeah,
Goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah, he
yeah,
knows all
I've
the
gotten
info.
things mailed. I think he's good. He knows all about book rate.
Yes.
You know, I mean, he knows the ins and outs of the business,
Yeah, he does. He does.
and since he doesn't, most of his stock he actually found. I mean, he used to be an avid every week. He had a circuit
Yeah.
in every city he's in, of used bookstores. And if they had anything of value, it was gone. I mean, and that was like art books, both art technique, art history, philosophy,
Sociology.
sociology, political science, depends. They were all, he would just hoover them up,
Yeah.
and
Oh, I wish well,
so
I
he
have to share
acquired.
I have to share this short story, very quick story about my child. My child was into books as a child. It all started with Berenstain Bear books, but anyway, he was into E.B. White, you name it, Roald Dahl. And then at one point he was into these, what is it? That the mystery, the children's mystery, boy and the girl, Nancy Drew, and then what's the boy of the Nancy Drew? What was the
The Hardy
The
Boys.
Hardy Boys.
Hardy Boy books? So he was into that for a while, and he wanted this particular Hardy Boy book, and we couldn't find it because it was out of print. So I was calling around Connecticut and found the bookstore that had these Hardy Boy books. So I drove him to this store so we could get the ones that it was out of print. And so he got them, read them, and then he grew up, and I decided I would just donate his books to the library in town, while he was away in college. He comes home, he goes, Mom, where are my books? And I said, well, honey, you grew out of them, so I donated them to the library. And he said, Mom, you got rid of those Hardy Boy books that we had to go drive around and, what do you call it? Out of print books. And I said, yes, darling, I did. And Man, I can't believe, don't ever do that again.
Yeah.
Anyway,
You can't
um,
buy it. You can't buy them anymore.
I know,
They've all
yeah.
been rewritten to,
Oh, Hardy Boy books?
yeah, to conform to modern
Sensibilities.
Oh, really? I didn't know
sensibilities.
that. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, well, there never was Frank Dixon, I don't think. I'm not sure.
Who's Frank Dixon?
I think he wrote the Hardy Boy books. He's the author whose title appears, but I think it must have been a team of people. I don't know.
Also, going to bring up something. Since you got a sort of an interest in Heraclitus, Dynamism is the philosophy which he seems to exhibit, and dynamism and rationalism are regarded as opposite world outlooks. So I talked to the Demon AI, and it gave me this list. So fascinating, you know. Core idea: reality is not fixed, but in constant flux, defined by movement, energy, and becoming. Now, dynamism, they say, was the worldview that Nietzsche finally sort of went into. He tried the conventional world. He just tried to be a rationalist, an idealist, and it wasn't working for him. And he just went, 180 degrees into dynamism.
Yes. Yes. So dynamism and rationalism, you got these from the AI?
Yeah, well, I did know that they were opposite worldviews.
Yeah, but I mean the text that
The
showed.
text from the AI, yeah.
Yeah. It's we're at an interesting stage in AI where, it's doing its best to simulate. It reads a lot of different sites and then it tries to put it together and say, well, if the majority is right, then this must be the answer you're looking for. And it's interesting because what it lacks is quality control. So when I'm doing my research on butterflies and plants, it gives no particular emphasis to actual scientific studies where they go out and into the field, for 5 years in a row, checking every summer with 14 volunteers and counting eggs. It treats that as exactly the same as Bob's butterfly site, where I just saw a pretty butterfly and I posted a picture and my claims about what it needs. It treats them as equivalent. And that's sort of where we are in the stages of development. But it hasn't done a bad job here with what you're listing. These are some reasonable examples. Um, and that's where we are with AI. It's not bad as a way to it's like Wikipedia. It's not bad as a way to get the conversation going.
Well, just don't ask AI for emotional advice.
No, no, it's bad.
Yeah, well, I was going to say that this thing, what I tend to notice with rationalism and rationalists is ultimately their outlook leads to a sort of a completely static state. Their ideal for humanity and human civilization is to make it completely predictable and dead.
Yes.
Because as soon as the rationalists finally succeed, it's all ended. We're frozen statues.
Right. Right. Abstract categories, unchanging. A fish is a fish and a bird is a bird, and never the twain shall meet. Everything has to be its own thing, which is funny because, I mean, we're constantly learning more. Under the new definitions coming out of genetic research, we're all fish. We're a subset of the fish called tetrapods, but we're fish. So are birds. Birds are fish. It's like, and our old categories have trouble with this. And the more attached we are to our old categories, the harder a time we have.
Rick, shh, you'll encourage the furries.
I know
It's bad enough already.
I have a mischievous streak. It's true. Well, okay. So I guess my wrap up on Ginny is you certainly don't have to visit Kenneth Smith while you're in Austin, but you can. He's not unapproachable. He's not actually on a pedestal. We can if you're interested, just let me know and we can arrange to have you visit him. He laughs a lot.
Oh, he laughs a lot. So do you want to share maybe his email so that maybe I could send him an email if I'm interested, and then go from there and see if he,
How about I share my email right there?
Oh,
And
let me just see if I have yours. Hold on one second.
you can email me and I'll call him and make sure he's up for visitors,
Okay.
and give me the dates of the trip. Because I mean, anytime one of us gets the chance, and anytime one of us is passing through Austin, I certainly want to encourage people to interact with
Oh,
him.
yeah.
He's a
So you
treat.
say he has a family.
Yeah,
Um,
he lives with his wife.
Wait a minute. Is MYXYZ42 at yahoo.com? Is that you, Rick? No, wait a minute.
No, I just posted in the chat, toad@eskimo.com.
Oh, okay. All right.
Toad@eskimo.com. But with that, why don't we do what Stephen is suggesting? I sensed the spirit of Sharon passed over Stephen as Stephen's like, why don't we turn this to philosophy? So why don't we do that? Why don't, we're so this is the week 170 of the Millennia and Microcosm Kenneth Smith seminar, and we're in medieval civilization, chapter 8. We've been here for a while. We're taking our time. We're slowing down in year 2 and going through the medieval stuff because we're now cross-cutting between Kenneth's text and texts of various medieval writers. And we're starting with the founding texts. So we spent a few weeks talking about the Gospel according to Thomas. This week we're going to start a couple of weeks talking about the Q source, and we will talk about some others too. And the goal is to augment what Ken is saying about the medieval civilization and its worldview with the actual text of various thinkers. And where we're starting is with the roots of Christianity, which help to define the thrust of the next 1,000 years once Christianity gets approved as the official religion of empire. But we're, once we get deeper into this, we're as I've mentioned before, we will also spread out and spend some time looking at the non-canonical perspectives, by which I mean, nuns, mystics, hermits, all the Sharon kind of alluded to this at the beginning of today's call, and I want to underscore it, that Kenneth's main thrust in the medieval section is talking about half of the dialectic of the medieval epoch, only half. And the half he's talking about is the religious empire and its genocidal goal of eliminating all other religions and having only not only Christianity, but its version of Christianity to be the only one that anybody will believe anywhere. And as we'll see when we get into the history, they set out to make that a reality. But that's not the whole truth of the medieval epoch. That's just the truth of the power structures of the medieval epoch. Because as Sharon alluded, there have always been Christians and Christian groups who don't believe in genocide, who are interfaith, who are, ecumenical, who are less interested in power and organization, and they're more interested in how do we take care of each other and how do we be good people. And that is one of the major themes of medieval civilization. It's the other half of the dialectic, and it is the collision between those two halves of the dialectic that ultimately brings medieval civilization to an end. In the end, when the imperial church becomes too power hungry, openly greedy, and corrupt, the vast majority of people who would rather follow the teachings of Jesus sort of rise up and break with the church, and it causes the eruption that leads to the Reformation and the modern epoch. So we'll get into all that. We're not gonna. I just want to underscore we're not going to neglect all those alternative teachings, and it starts today as we dig into Q, because Q is a very interesting document, and that's where we're gonna start today. So for those who kind of don't have the background, I'm gonna put a couple of links and a book recommendation into the chat. So the book is by Burton Mack. He's a biblical scholar. He's written, I don't know, 4 or 5 significant books on Christianity and evaluation of the New Testament. This one is the one that I'm reading right now. I'm 2/3 of the way through. I've had it for a couple of years and I've wanted to read it. This is my chance. Burton Mack, The Lost Gospel, the Book of Q and Christian Origins. There are a number of books you can get on the Q source, but most of them are primarily giving you a translation, and then they might give you a little intro, and then that's it. What I like about Burton Mack's book is he's He's summarizing the entire story of how did people come to discover there was such a thing as Q. It's totally different from Thomas. You remember Thomas, they actually found, they found in the 19th century, they found Greek fragments at Oxyrhynchus. And those fragments, they didn't know what they went to, but it sounded like Jesus, except there were Jesus quotes they'd never seen before. And they're like, what the hell is this? Well, in the 1940 or so, they stumble upon, I can't remember if it's Qumran or if it's the other one. They have the breakthrough where they find a pottery jars full of old codexes from very early in Christianity's history. And most of them are Gnostic, but the Gospel of Thomas is in there too. And the Gospel of Thomas is older than Gnosticism. And that's what we spent 3 weeks talking about. We actually have the text. It was when we discovered that text, which was written in Coptic, that we realized that the Oxyrhynchus fragments were also the Gospel of Thomas. They matched up, even though they had some differences. So in the case of the Gospel of Thomas, we're talking about a book that we'd heard references to, and we had fragments of, although we didn't know those fragments were from it. And then starting in 1940, we actually have the book. And it was of course excluded from the canon when the Bible was established. But in the case of Q, we do not have the book. Nobody has a manuscript copy called Q, and we don't even know what it was called. The Q is an abbreviation from the Greek word quella, which means source. And so, Burton Mack in his book, The Lost Gospel, the Book of Q and Christian Origins, he starts in his opening chapters explaining the history of biblical criticism, how it started among the Germans in the 19th century, why they started doing it. He describes the origin of the realization that John is different from the other three gospels, and that the three together would be called the synoptic gospels. He talks about people comparing them passage by passage, trying to line up where do they agree with each other and where do they disagree. And then how scholars have tried to understand why do they agree where they agree and why do they disagree where they disagree. And it's in the course of that they eventually figured out that Mark was written before the other three, which was a breakthrough. And it took an enormous amount of scholarship to arrive at that conclusion. I mean, in the New Testament as we have it, Matthew comes first. And for the longest time, all the best biblical scholars said, well, obviously Matthew's the first one because it's first, right? It's right there in the New Testament. It comes first. So it must have been written first. And it was quite a revelation when people figured out it couldn't possibly have been written first. Mark had to be written first. And that whoever assembled the canon chose to put Matthew ahead of Mark because they liked Matthew better, not because it was written first. That was an interesting breakthrough. So the next stage in the development of the realization that there was this Q document comes when scholars start to figure out that if Mark came first, that might explain why there are certain passages in Matthew and Luke that are very similar, sometimes right down to the wording, while there's others that are different. They said, the authors of Matthew and Luke, the communities responsible for creating Matthew and the community responsible for creating Luke, they evidently had a copy of Mark in their hands when they wrote Matthew and Luke, because there are passages that are clearly dependent on Mark. Mark has the earlier, less developed theology. It has the less persuasive arguments, the simpler arguments. It's stranger. It's less smooth and persuasive. It's more, Jesus is very odd in Mark. He behaves very strangely in a lot of ways. And Matthew and Luke both read Mark and said, no, we're not having that. And they smoothed that stuff out and they made Jesus more persuasive. And they sometimes they would, fudge an event from Mark and they'd shift it around and they'd make it happen at a different time or what have you. And they were able to trace this through the late 19th century, early 20th century. They were able to figure out the dependency. The authors of Matthew and Luke had access to Mark. But then they discovered something else. There's a bunch of material in Matthew and Luke, despite the fact that the Matthew and Luke communities were different from each other and disagreed with each other about a number of things. They had different priorities. Nevertheless, there's a number of places where Jesus does or says the same kind of thing in Matthew and Luke, and that it's completely missing from Mark. And they started to catalog how many things do Matthew and Luke have in common that's missing from Mark, and they found a lot of it. And this led them to a hypothesis. And the hypothesis is this: Mark wasn't the only thing they had in hand. When Matthew and Luke wrote their respective gospels, they had a second document. They had Mark, but they had something else, something we evidently don't have anymore, some very early document. And that other document helped them to frame what they were going to say in Matthew and Luke. They basically combined Mark and this other source that Mark maybe didn't know about to try to create a whole picture of Jesus, to say, what really happened. They're reconstructing, right? This is part of people have known for a long time that the authors of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John are not Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. Those are names that have been assigned to them. But what they do represent is communities, different groups within early Christianity that had passed along their oral traditions and their written traditions over time, so that they've diverged from each other. They had different areas of focus. And so by assigning these names, it's just sort of a shorthand for these are different Christian groups. So Matthew and Luke have some stuff in common. And the hypothesis that emerged was there must have been a second source. But we don't know, they don't ever say they used a second source. We don't have that second source. And so the Germans, who were the ones who came up with this hypothesis, they just used the word source, which in German is Quelle, which they abbreviated Q, to say whatever that second source is, let's just use the variable name Q to stand in for whatever it might have been called, which we don't know, whatever it was. But by doing this comparison, line by line comparison between these three gospels, the synoptic gospels, they were able to work out that the second source appeared to have been an older source, older than Mark. Like, a lot of what's in it is just sayings, like we saw with the Gospel of Thomas. Then Jesus said this, then Jesus said that, then Jesus said the other thing. A lot of what Matthew and Luke have in common is sayings, little aphorisms, sometimes parables, but especially aphorisms, and sometimes little fragments of story. Like, he went to this town and he did these things and he said these things. They'll be in both Matthew and Luke, but they won't be in Mark. And so they reconstructed, what, as best they could, what would have been in Q. And scholars have been working on this at this point for like 150 years. And they, as Burton Mack describes in his opening chapters, the process by which they concluded that Q must have been a real thing was a long, difficult, contentious process. And it was interrupted over and over by other exciting things going on in biblical scholarship, right? So like, in the 19th century, there was the search for the historical Jesus. This is what the Germans were after. They were trying to, they said, we can tell that some of what's in the Gospels is mythology. It's ballyhoo. It's designed to attract followers. If you peel that stuff off, who was the guy? Before they added all that stuff, who was the real Jesus? And they're working and working and working at it, and by the late 19th century, they're almost thinking they've got it when another writer has a big breakthrough and claims that, oh no, I'm not seeing the earliest evidence as being of this, Jewish teacher. I'm seeing the earliest evidence as being this wild-eyed apocalyptic guy from the desert saying the world is going to end and you all have to follow me. And that just completely sidelined the search for the historical Jesus for a long time. For decades, the biblical scholars were like, okay, let's try out Jesus as a wild-eyed prophet from the desert who's prophesying the end of the world, and it was not until that fell out of fashion and ran into trouble that people scratched their heads and went back and said, oh, weren't we working on some historical Jesus thing? And they kind of went back and picked up the threads of the 19th century and went with it. So the story of Q and how people came to realize that, what its structure that it must have existed, that it must have been in writing and not just oral, that because sometimes the wording is exactly the same, sometimes the sequence of the sayings is exactly the same, and that wouldn't happen if it was just oral transmission. There's a number of things like that have led them to gradually piece together that it must have existed, how old it must have been, that there must have been a whole community around it, that it was a very early Christian community, earlier than anything else we have testimony for, and eventually to figure out what was in it. So the first link I shared there is to the early Christian writings, top level page about the Book of Q. And you can look at it there. But the second link I gave is to a translation by Burton Mack. That's the same guy who did the book, right? And the translation that's there is in 3 parts. He says, because scholars at this point, since the 1980s, scholars have really come to an almost universal agreement that there are 3 layers of history captured in Q. And this is where it gets really interesting. And they figured it out because Q is a mix of three kinds of things, and they appear to have been written at different dates by different people. And the oldest layer appears to be wisdom sayings like Thomas. They're little aphorisms like Heraclitus, like would have been written on the great stone at the Oracle of Delphi, and that Alexander and his troops set up everywhere they conquered. They'd set up these, stelae with all these sayings carved into them. Evidently, sayings of the sages, wisdom literature that took that form was really common in the Greek world. And so people who were immersed in the Greek world or next to the Greek world or influenced by the Greek world, they too, in their own religions, wanted to have sayings of the sages. And between Thomas and all this early material in Q, it looks like that was the first thing written down and preserved about Jesus. What did Jesus say? Which, if you think he was a wise teacher, it makes sense, right? It's like, Ginny, right? Today we were talking about a little about Kenneth's life. What is this, 180? We've been doing these. And only now are we talking a little bit about, oh, maybe it's 170. Only now are we talking about his life, because the first concern is, look at all this cruel writing. Look at all these interesting things he said, right? And the hypothesis is that was the first stuff people wrote down about Jesus. They're like, have you heard this guy? Let me tell you some of the things that he said. And thus you get the structure of the Gospel of Thomas, and thus you get the early sayings layer in Q. And then decades later, the Q community evidently went through some kind of crisis, and they came back and they edited their Q document, and they added a new structure to it. And the new structure is eschatological. It's about the end times, and it's about that there will be a judgment. And are you good with Jesus or not good with Jesus? Because if you're not good with Jesus, you're going to be judged. And this stuff introduces the idea of wisdom, the spirit of wisdom, from ancient times, passing through, Greek and Jewish traditions, and it introduces the figure of John, and his role as beginning to think that maybe this Jesus guy is the embodiment of wisdom, and it introduces stuff about the Son of Man, which is a theme that Mark uses a lot. The Son of Man, and how the Son of Man is going to judge people at the end times, and all this stuff. When you see it in Burton Mack's thing, Burton Mack in the link that we've got there online, the bold stuff, not the headings that are bold, but the bold text is the first layer, the old wisdom sayings layer, and the plain text is the eschatological, the second, what he calls Q2, the second layer, where the Q community was going through a crisis, and they start putting this stuff about, look, you need to, we're tired of being judged. We want people to, identify whether they're with us or against us. I mean, they actually have Jesus say, you're either with me or against me, which is really different from the early material. It's very cranky and judgy. And then there's a third layer that comes at the end that Burton Mack thinks was added around 75. So after the invasion and defeat of Jerusalem by the Romans, after the crisis of the destruction of the temple, there's some fragments that have been added, and it's the smallest amount of material. There's just a few bits of it, but their tone is completely different. It is very pointed in its criticism of the Pharisees and the temple and what have you. And it includes a whole passage on the temptation, when Jesus is tempted by the adversary, and maybe turn away from your path. I'll make you Lord of all the earth and all that which you should be familiar to you guys from the Gospels. That gets added in the third layer around 75. And then Mack's line is that Mark would have written his gospel sometime between 75 and 80. And that sets up the time frame for the rest of it. I'll come back to this, but I want to pause and let Stephen come off mute and tell us what's on his mind.
Yeah, I remember you referring to the grumpy Jesus some time ago, and this is very curious. I was looking at some videos, and some people are pointing out how it seems like, for example, there's earlier forms of Mark which indicate Jesus with a lot of negative emotion, and then they've just rewrote it as positive emotion. So they were transforming the actual Jesus into something more palatable for middle class audience somehow.
Yes.
Like if I recall reading the gospel as a kid, and the picture we're giving is a very stylized and very consistent Jesus from the start to the end. And now I'm starting to wonder, well, did the real Jesus, go through evolutions of behavior and thought? But of
Yes.
course, it's like what ultimately became presented as the Christian narrative there was a rewritten concoction that was appealing to what they thought was the great sentiments in man. Now, I always thought, and I thought this for a long time, that when I've studied history, you come up with persistent attitudes. You got to think that we think the apostles are all gentlemen, or take Peter. Peter was the sort that's not going to take any rubbish from you. Peter's the sort that's going to smack you in the face. They don't. This has to be wiped out from history. Peter instead becomes a perfect rationalist. But this is the thing. One of the main engines of Christian growth was a man with a lot of choleric emotion, if it's true. This seems to be this sort of thing that they've changed, and it's curious, but they've created something to sell to a mass audience. What the wonder is how Christianity took off in the first place. Why did Jesus get such a strong following? And it was rewritten to persist, I suppose. Thank you.
Yeah, that's among the questions Burton Mack wrestles with in his book, The Lost Gospel, which I can highly recommend now that I'm two-thirds of the way through it. It's just very well written. I like books that don't just present the author's point of view. I like the author to have a point of view and to be clear about what it is, but I like it when they start with a survey. What material, what other points of view are there? What work has been done in this area? Why is this my point of view? What is the basis for me thinking this? Why don't I think something else? I mean, I want people to lay out their thinking for us so that we can chew on it. And that's what Burton Mack does. His opening chapters are just as valuable as it is to read the Q stuff in translation, the opening chapters and the ones afterwards where he does his interpretation. He points out, notice these themes, notice this use of this word repeatedly, notice this phrase. Why would the author be doing this? What are they trying to say? I just find that material so valuable. It's exegesis, right? It's just helping us to explore. So part of what he argues is that the earliest layer of Q, and we're gonna go through some of Q here and today. Today we're gonna do the earliest layer. Next week we'll do the eschatological layer. But the earliest layer, it just doesn't have anything about the end times or judgment or I am the Son of God or any of that stuff. It's all missing, and it is entirely wisdom teachings. Here's how you should behave. Here's how to be a good person. Here's how to think about the world. And it appears to be wisdom literature for itinerant preachers, for people who go from place to place, spreading the word about how to be good people. And as he says, there's also that bottom layer appears to have two different, maybe 5 years apart. It's got two different layers to it as well. And the second layer starts to deal with, there might be in different towns, there might be house churches that welcome you. And when you're just preaching to the crowd, feel free to be like Diogenes the Cynic and engage in humorous rhetorical argument and paradoxes and conundrums. But when someone welcomes you into their house to actually stay for a while, be polite, don't torment them. It's sort of like how to behave yourself if in a community that's beginning to be a community. It's beginning to not just be wandering wisdom folk, but it's beginning to be, people who take care of each other. And it's exciting to see the emergence of that material in that first layer, because you're sort of seeing history in motion. So aside from that, the Mark stuff, the cranky Jesus, it comes with Q2, and that's what we'll talk about next week. We'll talk about cranky Jesus and why would he be cranky in what happened in the Q community after the first layer that made them change their attitude towards the world.
There's another aspect as well.
Yeah, please.
Because we keep on getting told in the gospel that there were the teachings open for the public.
Yes.
And there were the secret teachings.
Yes. Yes. That's right. That's right. That becomes a recurring theme as well. So it's interesting. And I really like this kind of work that's being done to excavate the texts and look at the seams in them and try to figure out what they mean. It's exciting. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Hello, everybody. I just had a quick thought to add that's more of just some flavor to go along with what we're doing. Talking about how this rebranding of Jesus or Christianity in general to like change from this almost like small group of people who'd want to do things their way to this large group that needs to be one size fits all, right? And it has to be Jesus and Christianity in general has to be rebranded or made into this corporate thing. So I was just thinking of it's an older movie of all things now, and it's interesting how it feels so old, even though whatever. This movie called Dogma by not Kevin Smith, but by Kevin Smith, not Kenneth Smith. And essentially, there's this part which I didn't realize, thinking about it from my older self versus my younger self, how brilliant the scene was where they got George Carlin of all people playing the Catholic priest or bishop for the area, and they're going to have this big celebration for Jesus, and they're literally rebranding Jesus as Buddy Jesus, and he looks like, yeah, that's exactly it, right? And he looks like, again, I'm going to date myself and also really specify myself as someone like oh, now I can't. My memory is failing. It's the cheeseburger place I grew up with as a kid that had this statue of oh. Anyways, he's like Buddy. He's like a Buddy Jesus kind of guy with it, but for a hamburgers joint. I can't remember. If it comes back to me, I'll write it or interject it
What's his
later.
name's
But
Big
it's
Boy?
essentially
Roy's.
Yes, Bob's Big Boy. Thank you. That's the one. And so
Yeah.
I grew up in a place where they had one of the original places, and it still had its old statue of Bob Big Boy. And it's again this like friendly guy to make you want to eat cheeseburgers. And I'm like, think this is Buddy Jesus for sure. This is Buddy Jesus. And it's just so interesting that Buddy Jesus doesn't have any of these cranky Jesus things, right? They whitewashed that out, or especially like Buddy Jesus is really like more like salesman Jesus. I'm not exactly sure if there's so many good critiques in Buddy Jesus here. But if I'm not mistaken, this is pointing out in this fake sort of comedic satire way what has really happened in history, but also like what you're pointing out that's really kind of interesting about humanity in general is we're doing all this all the time with Jesus. Every time we say the word Jesus, the word means something different to different people at different times. And it's this very dynamistic sort of approach to his identity as a sort of static approach. And that like it's kind of really interesting to think, what did Jesus mean to the people who knew him when he was alive? That's one guy. Who was he after he died to the people who knew him, right? These are the same people that knew him, but now they know him differently. He's either as a martyr or as a spiritual entity or as their friend that they miss, or all of the above, right? And then that just goes on forward and forward through life. That what were the next people that knew those people, and how did they form a relationship with Jesus through this sort of telephone game? And at some points, I think the interesting thing that we're focusing on is a good question. I don't know if you've asked this question accurately. Is it deliberately, or is it sort of smuggled in? Meaning, like, was there ever a meeting between, some clergy of apostles between Mark and John and Paul. Of course, they didn't exist, but in this fantasy, they do. They all exist. And they're talking just like, how would we like to rebrand Jesus? Should we make him Buddy Jesus? Or should we keep him as, so is there any sort of like conspiratorial version of this, which is like there must be with the church actually doing this all the time, much later in history, trying to come up like, how do we need to rebrand Jesus so that it meets the needs of what we are trying to do in the world? And then more hard to ask, which is no one really knows, is when they're asking to like reach brand Jesus, how almost like I think we had this was term of like the Romans or the Greeks, like when they show up, they're like, oh yeah, we're stronger than you, you're weaker, submit, and then everything be good. And they could be totally upfront and honest how they're just conquering and essentially doing genocide, right? Where the Christians in this case open to themselves, like, oh, we're just doing genocide, and we need to project onto this idea of God to match that, and therefore we have to smuggle in all this baggage. Of course, they're not doing any of that psychodynamics, but at some level, they were being honest with themselves and to the people that they're conquering or interacting with. Like, this is who we think Jesus actually is, but we're going to present him differently than we actually think he is so that we can accomplish our agenda. And when does that transform where the person that we thought we always knew him to be and the person we're presenting, when do those transform, meaning that the presentational version of Jesus is the only version I remember, right? When did that happen? Did that happen all at once? Did it happen all a bunch of times? I mean, I think it's happening all the time, even now, on small degrees. But there must have been some point in history where there were big moments where, like, and maybe that's what we're trying to identify. I don't know. All these questions are percolating up. I don't know how many of them are actually valuable to the rest of you guys. But for me, it's like, it's more like you get to this idea that the more I know, the more I don't know. And this idea, like, I don't really have a clue who Jesus was or what he is. I only have the books, which these words are written on a page, and then people who are alive now telling me what these things think to them, right? So, it's like if dinosaurs existed, we don't have a clue what this word really means. We just know that there are some dinosaurs in politics who are going to become extinct soon. So, I don't know. I just find it really fascinating. At the same time, I'm trying to be honest that we're also trying kind of playing this game that we really don't know, but we're trying to engage in the process of knowing, but something that's ultimately like not really possible to know. So I guess that's enough of me rambling. As Donald would say, get me off of this thing. I'll go back to listening. That'll be good.
Thank you, Ari. It's one of the most interesting things about Christianity is the struggle to try to identify the layers that have been added over time. And one of the things that comes out of the study of this is that the study of Christianity is just as legitimate as the study of Jesus. So even if something is added later that Jesus didn't say, and it's added by some Christian sect, say in 75 or 80, that doesn't mean it's not good and interesting and true, right? Some very valuable, moral teachings show up later in smoother, more explicated form. The Good Samaritan story. There isn't any evidence for the Good Samaritan in Thomas or in Q, so it was probably added later. But it's a good story. It puts you in the mind of the way that the ancient Greeks treated mythography as a sacred duty. How can you teach the most important things about how to be good and what the world is like in a way that it's accessible to everybody and they can all understand it? And if you come up with a new, better way to do that, it makes sense that a living tradition is going to try to incorporate that into the text. Now, not everything that people try to incorporate into the text is done with the good of the many in mind. Sometimes it's with power and control. And so you always have to look at these additions and evaluate them morally and say, is this an improvement or is this not an improvement? But we can't assume from the outset either that it is or that it isn't. It all has to be sort of evaluated. Dogma, the film, yeah, Buddy Jesus is my favorite part of Dogma. That scene when just the shamelessness of the character that you're identifying who's going, yeah, we want everybody to feel like he's their friend. And there's the statue colorfully painted with Jesus going with a big shitty grin on his face. And you're like, wow, this is not the Jesus of Mark at all. And it's certainly not even the Jesus of the earliest layer of Q. That, by the way, that satire that's in there is almost certainly inspired by a Tom Lehrer song from the 60s called The Vatican Rag. And if you guys have never heard The Vatican Rag, there's a link for it right there. Tom Lehrer was a mathematician, and he was a musical satirist. He was also a musical chameleon. He played piano, and he could play piano in any style. I mean, he could do Mozart, he could do ragtime, he could do anything. And he would come up with these satirical songs about society and set them to some highly exaggerated style, whether it was the blues or ragtime or a waltz or what have you. And they're often just hilarious. And the Vatican Rag is exactly the same theme as Buddy Jesus. It's like, he's talking about Vatican II and how can the Catholic Church, make itself more relevant to today's, youth, the youth of today. And as he says in his opening before he starts the song, I happen to have a modest suggestion, evoking Jonathan Swift's Modest Proposal. And then he begins to play the Vatican Rag, which is just, oh my God, anyway, feel free to listen to it on your own time. It's one of my favorite things he ever did. So, but yeah,
Wait, before you move forward, I want to give a little homage to Tom Lehrer and my personal relationship to him. As a kid, we would go on vacations, driving places. My parents would literally put in the tape cassette tapes of Tom Lehrer and all his songs, and like Poisoning Pigeons in the Park and all these other totally useless, amazing songs that I highly recommend. He was fantastic. I really enjoyed him. So yeah, that's it.
And I bring him up not just because he's a great follow-on and explanation of the film Dogma and its satire of trying to make a kinder, gentler Jesus for the masses, but also because the spirit of the satire in Dogma, the spirit of the satire in Tom Lehrer, actually takes us close to the spirit of the original layer of Q. As Burton Mack argues, even in Matthew and Luke, you can see some of the Jesus as mischievous troublemaker. There's the fact that he likes riddles and parables, and he often likes to juxtapose opposites to confound the audience and make them think whether they like it or not. But also the fact that he directly confronts the authorities and says things they don't want to hear. That mischievous troublemaker tradition goes all the way back to Diogenes the Cynic. And as Burton Mack argues, cynicism, not the modern cynicism, which is about, nihilism and not believing anything, but the original Greek cynicism is about the idea that society's corrupted and there's things that need to be criticized. And one of the best ways to do it is with humor. It's comedy, that you go out there like Diogenes and you go into the middle of the marketplace and you shine a lit lamp around at everybody. And eventually someone exasperated says, "What are you doing? It's daylight. Why do you have a lit lamp?" And Diogenes says, I need this lamp to help me search for an honest man. And then he'll put the lamp on the guy who asked the question and shake his head sadly and move on to the next one. He's a troublemaker. The famous story of Plato with his definition of man as a featherless biped. And in comes Diogenes and hurls a plucked chicken down on the floor and said, "Behold, Plato's man." And a pained expression passes over Plato's face, and he adjusts his definition to a featherless biped having broad, flat nails. Diogenes was a troublemaker, right? He was an instigator. He's trying to use comedy to confront the hypocrisy of society. And the thing is, in the Hellenistic world that follows, after Alexander the Great conquers the Middle East and Persia all the way to the boundaries of India, they set up Hellenistic civilization across that whole area. And we're talking Palestine. There are stadiums, there are theaters, there are gymnasia, there are wandering cynics out there doing their little philosophical comedy routine.
I was just wondering, Rick, would you describe Diogenes as more a Philistine or a fanatic? Because they're opposites.
They are opposites. Well,
I mean, Alfred E. Newman is the great Philistine of the...
He's a Philistine. Diogenes is a Philistine. And part of the way we know it is they used to write little books to each other, little guidebooks to say, how can you be a wandering cynic? And one of the instructions is you just can't get angry. You cannot lose your temper ever. You have to always look for the clever humor in every situation. And if someone confronts you, they're not hurting you. They're setting up the next joke. You just have to figure out what it is. Something in what they're saying is completely missing the point, and it's your job as the cynic philosopher and in the spur of the moment to spot what it is, to spot the funniest way to dramatize it, and then that's your response. So you have to have a thick skin, right? And that's not the sign of a fanatic. That's a Philistine. That's Alfred E. Newman.
Well, I note that what we're in the grip of now in this current age, and it's surprising because I was born to a more Philistine age.
Yes.
We are now living in the world of fanaticism.
We are. We are. Sense of humor, we're sort of struggling with that. But the point that Burton Mack makes is there are certain parts of what Jesus says that are just deadly earnest and serious, but there's certain parts of what Jesus says that are hilarious. They're confrontational. He's a muckraker. He's raking the muck. He's stirring up trouble. And he's doing it in order to dramatize the inadequacies of our current, in his day, the contemporary power structure. And Burton Mack says, what's striking about the layers in Q is that it's the earliest layers that are the most mischievous. I mean, yeah, on the one hand, it's about loving one another and taking care of the poor, but it's expressed often in humorous, riddling, confrontational ways. And so what Tom Lehrer is doing with the Vatican rag is not entirely unlike what Jesus is doing in the oldest layer of Q. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I just wanted to follow up on something that Harry was talking about. And I'll be brief about this. One of the things that I think is consistent about the early Christian faith is the discord. And the discord revolved around the faith, the elements of the faith. And I think we're sitting here and we're looking at the contributions that were included and the contributions that were left out and the contributions that were included, where they originated from and their authenticity. So as the political elements, as the Roman Empire started falling and the political elements wanted something to unite the people, they looked around at this early Christianity and they took hold of it. And it's called Catholic. And Catholic really means universal. So they attempted to unite this doctrine. And the second thing they did is that at the Council of Nicaea, out of that came the Apostles' Creed. And in fact, it is still relevant because the Pope, after 1700 years, visited the site a couple of weeks ago, because it is still one of the things that unite the faith. And according to different sources, each disciple had a line in that 12-line creed. And that was an attempt at unity. This is what the Christian faith should look like, regardless of what's in the Bible. This is what we're going to believe, and this is how we're going to behave. And this is, and more importantly, this is the nature of Jesus Christ. I believe in God the Father, maker of heaven and earth. And he goes on and on and on. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. There'll come a stage this year when we actually go to the Apostles' Creed and look at it. It's interesting. We can actually trace some of its origin fairly. It's surprisingly early. So many things that we associate with the practices of Christianity arise in the 2nd or 3rd or 4th century, but the Apostles' Creed is old. It goes way back. It's back to the house churches and shared meals stage of Christianity. It's very interesting.
And even though we had attempts at unity, when the Pope got there 2 weeks ago, he had to not say a line because the Eastern Orthodoxy would have been offended. So there's still that discord.
Yes. Thank you, Sharon. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, there's the other aspect is the two Jesuses. There was the natural Jesus and the supernatural Jesus. Is an element that's in that early Christianity, and of course they end up trying to unite the two. So, for example, if you're a secularist, you're going to probably say, well, the supernatural Jesus is the Jesus of the narrative the church created over the actual man that lived. Or if you're a mystic like me, you believe that the supernatural Jesus is like a god which possesses the earthly man, which is, of course, what the ancients tended to believe in with all their pagan gods were elements of this, that human beings had a limited capacity, and for the greater aspect, possession by a spirit occurs, and there's difficulties in this because the spirits are not human. They need a translator. They need to possess a particular human that they merge with, that they take on the characteristics with, to work within humanity or even to understand them or navigate our world. And our world is a world of emotions, for example, not just the external, but all the internal aspects of what a human is. So the positive spirit is trying to create a progress. But on the other hand, you also have the negative spirits, which are doing the same thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I popped into the chat a couple of comments from my wife. Those of you who don't know, she entered Bright School of Divinity, and she's just finishing up her second semester now. And I don't get to see her very often. Even though she's here and I'm here, I only see her a few hours each night for dinner because she just study, write all the time, just relentlessly. So she
I was
was
just about to ask if she was there because I like the comment.
Yeah, she's
Thank you.
upstairs. She's upstairs studying. She'll have a class this afternoon. I just before this, I read the paper she's turning in for today.
She's working on her doctorate?
Well, she's going to start with a master's, and then she'll see when she's done with the master's if she ever wants to do study again. And if she's not burned out on it, then she might go on to get the doctorate. But right now, the plan is the master's. So she got oh yeah, there it is, Stephen. Thank you. She for some reason YouTube suggested the recording David made of last week's seminar that we had together, and it had Sharon's question about the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, and so Beverly sent me a text reply saying, oh, since she had just studied this in seminary, and this was what they learned about the history of the two. So we'll come back to them later, but I just wanted to share that with you since Beverly went ahead and did the write-up. So yeah, it's interesting. It's like a Sherlock Holmes story in a way. We have all this evidence. We don't know what all the evidence means, and we're trying to sift through it to get back to what originally happened and what happened after that, and so on. So another reason that I highly recommend Bert and Mac's book on Q, aside from all the stuff, and we're gonna do some Q today. We'll actually do some of the text, but I want to talk a little bit more about the book. Part of what I like about it is that he says, and I've heard this before from other biblical scholars, in relation to Paul's epistles. He says the hardest thing is to take the author as meaning exactly what they say, because we've all been marinating in the Gospels. So it's very hard for us not to project our understanding from the Gospels into Paul's epistles, where they don't belong, because Paul was writing decades before the Gospels were written. I mean, his understanding of Christianity in the church had to have been a different understanding than Mark's or Matthew's or Luke's, who were writing, significantly later. And there are places where those differences are right out in front of us. And Paul just basically says, with no hiding or cryptic, evasion whatsoever, he says the weird thing from our perspective that he actually believes, and he says it well, but we can't hear it because we're so sure he must mean the gospel part. And so we treat his epistles as a Rorschach test, and we project onto them our expectations. This is what the Greeks are talking about about epistemology and the difficulty of humans understanding things. Well, Burton Mack says the same thing about Q that those other scholars said about Paul. It's very hard for us to read Q as it actually is, because we want to fill in the blanks with all the rest of what we know, right? Because we assume the complete picture is the one we have. But it's not true, right? The complete picture is the one the Q community had, which they've only shared part of with us. But there's no guarantee that the rest of their picture matches the rest of our picture. So our picture is the result of 2,000 years of theology and discussion and history. Whereas theirs, especially that first layer, they're writing around 40. This is like 10 years after Jesus died. There's no real church yet, as is really clear from the fragments we've got. So all our expectations about the church and how it works that we want to project into this stuff doesn't belong there any more than it belongs in Paul. As we proceed over the next couple of months, going from Thomas to Q, we'll do Paul, we'll do the Didache, and I just discovered day before yesterday another one I want to do called the Dialogue of the Savior, and another one I've known about for a few months is the Preaching of Peter. All of these things are sayings and dialogue gospels, very different from the narrative gospels we're familiar with. And so they give us these insights into these earlier stages in the development of the church and the development of the theology and in the impression of who they thought Jesus was. It's very different before Mark, especially before Mark. So as a part of that, his fourth chapter in the Lost Gospel is entirely about Galilee. He says, if you want to know who Jesus was, you have to know what Galilee was like. And most biblical scholars are writing from a perspective in which they want to defend their understanding of the theology and the stories as they've heard them. And so they project onto Galilee their expectations. Typically, you'll hear people say it's a rural, ignorant backwater. Everybody's illiterate. They're just fishermen and carpenters. They don't know much. They're not scholars. And it's very Jewish. They're just very Jewish, rural, ignorant people. And that's who Jesus was. He was a gifted guy in that framework. And that's the picture. That's the dominant picture in scholarship today. And Burton Mack says the problem is all the archaeology and sociology we have about Galilee says that's false. Says that's a picture that satisfies our expectations, but it doesn't appear to be what Galilee was actually like. So in chapter 4, he gives you a map showing here's Judea with Jerusalem in the south and Idumea south of that. North of Judea is Samaria, and north of Samaria is Galilee. And Galilee to the north has Syria, and to the west it has the Phoenician coast with the big cities, and to the east it has the Decapolis, which is 10 Greek cities set up by Alexander the Great and his followers. And Burton says, the interesting thing to know about Galilee, first of all, it's not in Israel back then. There isn't in Israel. These kingdoms are all separate from each other. That the Samaritans would never have agreed that they're part of Judea at all. They did not like the Judeans, and the Judeans did not like the Samaritans. They really saw themselves as different people. The Samaritans were the ones who stayed during the Babylonian exile. And the people of Judea came back after the Babylonian exile. And when they came back, they had a whole lot more books, the holy books. And the Samaritans said, no, only the first 5 books count. And the Judeans said, no, all these other books count too. And they to this day, they're still angry about it. I mean, it's like 2,000 years of serious disagreement. And neither side would ever say, I'm part of that group. Right? The split had happened, and it has yet to be healed. The Idumeans south of Judea likewise would never have said, "Oh yeah, we're totally part of your group." And of all of these groups, the ones that were the least likely to be a joiner and to be excited about being part of something was the Galileans, says Burton Mack. I love this section. This is some really revelatory history. It's why I was so excited to share this with you today, because it totally changes our expectations about who is Jesus who came from Galilee. And here's what he has to say. He says there's big cities, right, like Jerusalem to the south, but Galilee only has small towns. But they're not hick backwater towns, because Galilee is a highly successful breadbasket, right? Their land is incredibly fertile. It's a bunch of valleys and hills. They're growing food everywhere. The lakes are full of fish. They've got craftsmen. And this place has been ruled over for centuries by Romans, by Greeks, by people from Mesopotamia, by Persians, by anybody, but hardly ever by Jews. There was a brief period from 100 to 67 BCE when the Jews were in charge of Galilee. And that was it. For that entire 300-year period, mostly they were a cosmopolitan crossroads. And they were a major trading place. They weren't a center, they didn't have a big city, but they had enormous numbers of trade routes that went from the big cities on the coast, Phoenicia, or from the north, Syria, over to the Decapolis to the east, where all these Greek city-states are. And the Greek city-states are big powerhouses, and they need access to the coast, and all those roads are passing through Galilee. And meanwhile, Galilee is producing all these foods and crafts works that they're trading with all the people around them. It says, this is an area where no one religion dominates. Judaism isn't the religion of Galilee. There isn't a religion of Galilee. They have many religions. There's not one race in Galilee. It's not all Jews. There's Greeks, there's Romans, there's non-Jewish Semites, there's Arabs, there are Mesopotamians, there's all Phoenicians, there's all kinds of people here. It is cosmopolitan. It is a kind of rural cosmopolitanism that doesn't fit into our easy categories, but was typical of a period when there was an enormous amount of communication and back and forth. Imagine the small towns along the Silk Road. They might be small towns, but it's the Silk Road. Literally, information is passing from China and India to Europe and back and forth. If you were on the Silk Road, you were not a hick, no matter how small your town was. You probably spoke multiple languages. And that's what Burton Mack says. All the evidence suggests about Galilee. Everybody in Galilee was at least bilingual. And frequently they were trilingual or quadrilingual, because many of them spoke Greek. I mean, it had been Hellenized for centuries. This was part of Alexander the Great's empire, part of the Seleucid empire that followed it. Some of them spoke Latin. Lots of them spoke Aramaic, because once upon a time this had been Aramaic lands. And some of them spoke Jewish, but there probably weren't any big temples. And the only synagogues they had were the old style synagogue, where it's not a building, but it's just like a house church. It's a gathering. It is a place of many languages and many faiths. And he says the important thing to know about Galilee, aside from its cosmopolitanism, the important thing to know about Galilee is they're not joiners because everybody invades them. Because they don't have a big city, they don't have a big military, they can't fight back. Because they don't have those things, they're also not a prime destination for conquest. Nobody sets out to say, I'm going to build a vast empire, and the jewel of my empire will be Galilee. They're like, oh God, Galilee. And one of the reasons is there's no big roads. There's small trade roads. But there's a big road on the coast in Phoenicia, and big armies march up and down that thing all the damn time. And there's a big road to the east, they called the King's Road. And armies are constantly marching up and down the King's Road, but neither of those roads passes through Galilee. Galilee's between them. And so it's not a convenient place to conquer, and it's not a respectable place to own, but it's an easy place. I mean, you can conquer it. They don't have any big armies. He says, so that more than in Judea, more than in Idumea, more than in Samaria, the reality of Galilee is a relentless tide of temporary conquerors who are not interested enough to stay and dominate and do anything. They come in, they take over, they say, all bow before my glorious self that I'm now in charge. I want you all to be passionate and excited about me as a king and my religion. And then they get bored and move on and go conquer somewhere more interesting, and they leave Galilee. He says this has been going on for 300 years. Galilee is like Iowa. No, I'm thinking of Missouri, the show me state. Galilee is the people who are just not having it. They're like, yes, I'm sure you're a very exciting king. Yes, what a nice religion you have. That's fabulous. But we're not joiners. And one of the ways that we know this is one of the main testimonials we have to this period of history is written by Josephus. He writes the Wars of the Jews He has a couple of books that he's written about his experiences before and after the conquest of Judea by the Romans. And before he joined the Roman side, he was fighting against the Romans. And he tried to organize one of the cities on the coast, and he tried to get the Galileans excited about fighting back against the Romans, and they wouldn't do it. He said, "Come on, we're the people of the book. We're the Israelites. We have to fight back and we have to organize." And the Galileans are going, "Nah." I'm sure that's very exciting for you, but nah. And he ends up writing in the book, the problem with the Galileans is they're too peaceful. They don't seem to be very excited about this is not a place that produces zealots, says Josephus. Now, isn't this a different picture than what most of us were given? Most of us are thinking that Jesus mostly lived in Israel and was mostly from entirely Jewish communities and wouldn't have had exposure to Greek or Latin or any of those other things. We wouldn't have thought that they had gymnasia or theaters or, all these things that we associate with Hellenistic culture. We don't associate that with Jesus's childhood.
Yeah, but he gave the apostles Greek names.
Say that again?
He gave his apostles Greek names.
Yes, many of them have Greek names. Yes.
No. He called them. He said, "I'm going to call you a Greek name."
Peter, Petros.
Simon. Yeah. Hi, Simon. I'm going to give you a Greek name. I don't know what the trip is.
Yeah. It's like if he doesn't speak Greek, why is he giving him a Greek name? And so if this is the background, this is not the background we're expecting. This is not a convenient background for the usual story that we're given. But the more we learn about the history and archaeology and sociology of Galilee, the more this comes into focus that Galilee is the place that they're not joiners. They're a little cynical about all these different kings and their religions claiming we're the one true king and you all have to get patriotic and excited about us. They're like, yeah. Here's your taxes. Shut up and leave us alone. So we'll come back to this, but first I want to go to the comments. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. Oh, you're a little broken up there, Ari. We can't quite hear you. Oh yeah, you're very digitized. Oop, and there he went. All right, we'll call on him when he comes back. Go ahead, Stephen. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I'm just make this point again after doing a lot of history that we don't understand older times all that well. And this is it, that the vast amount of the population was dirt poor. If we're talking about Jesus, we're even talking about Peter, they were sort of middle class. They had something in their life. Jesus's family background were carpenters. They were businessmen. They had connections. They had extended family. Peter's got a boat. He's probably got a little stretch of coast on the Galilee with a rock on one side and a rock on the other, saying, "That's my stretch of beach, dude." And woe betide anybody that tries to run up on my beach, dude. So he in a sense had ownership of something, but of course you had the lot at the top, like the Sadducees, are very rich, are very wealthy. So you had, of course, this middle class to us would have looked dirt poor, but by the standards of their time, they weren't. They had a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of understanding, but the vast mass of the population were people who had nothing. Maybe they were the poor that Jesus is talking about. And I mean, they had nothing. They had literally, even their clothes were probably donations. And they earned a meager living in harvest time and stuff like that with odd jobs. And it wasn't a good place to be. You were really on the margin when you were living like that. You probably had virtually no family. couldn't go to the temple because the temple cost money. You had to pay a fee for a lot of stuff. That's like when in Luke, you have that clash between Matthew and Luke in the nativity story. Well, in Luke, it seems more believable. Luke says Mary was confined for 40 days. Then they went to the temple and paid some money. Well, the poor had virtually no money. There's the vast mass of the population were not on the level of Jesus, Joseph, or Mary. They were the people that the Sadducees might bother to talk to. The Sadducees aren't going to talk to the poor. They're not even on the radar. They're just the flora and fauna of the landscape. They don't matter. They're just there to be told what to do. They're not there to be listened to. They might listen to Jesus's family, but not the poor. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Ari, you're back. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. See if you're
Yeah, try a little better. Hopefully,
Oh, that's better.
can you guys hear me?
That's much better.
Okay, great. Yeah, I had to reconnect. No, I was going to say about your whole spiel about Galilee. First of all, it's fascinating, and I'm no expert, but it sounds terribly plausible. So and mostly again, like, what would other trading areas be like, or what would other bread baskets be like? It's not quite a perfect match in terms of the trading, I don't think, but the way you're describing it reminded me of Poland and the way it's between, or even Ukraine, between, it's these bread baskets that don't really fight, and that's because they're between large empires that just expect them to make a lot of food. And that's kind of the deal. You get to do your thing if you make your food, and it's very much like uh yeah like a sharecropper, someone who's not quite a slave, but isn't quite free either. And their job is they have to tend the land, and they get in big trouble if they don't make enough food for their masters. Um, so I was just thinking that that would make a lot of sense. And these are going to be categories that reoccur throughout all of human history and human development. We're going to have these areas where these kind of places are going to exist, and then these type of people are going to prop up in there, and they're going to say things that because they're between these worlds and they have good access to some key information, someone's going to share it in a way that's really going to catch on. And then, of course, interestingly enough, I'll go ahead and validate Stephen's mystical idea. I kind of believe in, not that I necessarily know what I actually believe, and if there was a guy named Jesus, I kind of tend to believe in both versions of him. That he's got some mystical aspects to him, which I don't have access to, so I'll leave that alone. That's not really something I can investigate. There's no science there. It's all just who knows what kind of quality this information is, and a lot of people are really convinced on it. And the fact that it recurs in certain types of patterns makes it pretty credible. And at the same time, there's also the purely natural Jesus. And I'll be honest, that's kind of how I relate to my own spirituality and stuff on a lot of other things. It's just there's aspects of both, and I'm just gonna go with it because I don't really have all the answers, and that's the best I got. So there you go. But yeah, I thought it was a good analogy. I thought things like Poland. I was curious if there are other places, maybe Ukraine fits, but what other places that are more like maybe like an island, like Sicily or something, that are really useful strategically to go between all these different places? I mean, I think of the Holy Land area is kind of like that in general. It's this place between continents, so it's terribly between empires. But okay, that's enough. Thanks.
Thanks, Ari. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I just wanted to follow up on the demographic of Galilee. Yes, it was at the time of Jesus' teaching, that was a very poor city or county. And that's where Jesus did most of his teachings, his parables, and his miracles. And in fact, the Sermon on the Mount was delivered overlooking the Sea of Galilee. And secondly, yes, the people were impoverished, so to speak, but Jesus in that sermon says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And by that, I think he means that their spirituality, they totally acknowledge God for their room, board, and shelter. And in modern day, they say if you want to learn about Christianity, you really need to look at the poor, because you have utter dependence on God for all your needs. And that gives you a kind of humility, I think. So poverty was one of the things that Jesus acknowledged in his time, like the woman in the temple giving her last mite, and the disciples were criticizing her. And he said, "Leave her alone. She's giving all she has. That's it." So Jesus was very cognizant, I think, of people who were poor. And the other question I have is the I don't want to say dimensions. Is the path of the Silk Road, did it pass through any of these areas where Jesus was teaching? Because the time frame in history, it seems to be contiguous with the time frame in history. Because along the Silk Road, not only do they trade goods and services, but religion was a significant part of the Silk Road. And you had Jewish sects along the road, you had Christian sects along the road. And so I wanted to know how that configured, that probably amplified the confusion in Christianity. Yes, right?
Oh yeah,
Um,
for sure.
but I thought when you mentioned it, that was an interesting dimension, because I've always been interested in the Silk Road and I can't get my head around it geographically. Thank you.
Yeah, this end of the Silk Road, it has split out into lots of filaments. And it's part of what made everything from, Arabia to Egypt to the Middle East to Turkey all rich, is that this was, the all the goods flowing from Asia were coming and ramifying out into all these. And they had to, I guess part of the point that Burton Mack is making is Galilee is one of the places where lots of tiny roads came off the Silk Road to arrive at the big port cities on the Mediterranean. And so, you'd have lots of people with carts, and mules and moving goods east and west, through there to get to the richer places at both ends. This isn't like there are places further east where the Silk Road is more of a single large passage and people are building cities and towns along it. But by the time you get here, it's broken up into its tributaries, I guess you'd say. So yeah, it's a crossroads of civilizations, basically.
Yeah, and the cultural and religious impact of that traffic,
yes,
is significant, I think.
It is. It is. And the other major, just building on that theme, you talked about like fragments of lots of different cultures all swirling around. There's another point Burton Mack makes in the book, which is that when Alexander the Great conquered this area centuries before, he was representing the classical or late classical stage. I guess middle classical by the numbers, but let's say past the peak represented by Athens and Sparta, of the classical worldview, the classical way, the classical political economy, the city-state, the polis, right? And what he was conquering was not other city-states. Mack makes this point, and it's really interesting to me in light of the whole purpose of Kenneth Smith's book. He's saying what he's conquering is a much older way of life. Instead of city-states, they're temple states. Your king is either a god or the high priest of the god. And at any rate, the religion and the politics are united in Egypt, in Babylon, in Persia, in all these places. There is an alignment between the religious authorities and the political authorities into this figure of a god king or a priest king. And some of these civilizations, they turn over every few centuries, across, Western and southern Asia here. But some of them, like Egypt, have been going concerns for 3,000 years. The temple state has been going for so long that, thinking about it, I think this is probably the strongest candidate for what was the epoch that preceded the classical world. It was the temple state before the city state. And what Alexander the Great has done is use the power, the new vitality and power of the city state, to smash all of the temple states from Egypt and North Africa all the way east to the boundaries of India. They're gone. Before him, that's what it was, wall to wall, all the way across that enormous distance. And after him, they're all gone. And they've all been replaced by city states. We talked before about the stela at the Oracle of Delphi with all the engravings, know thyself, and the rest carved into it, and the evidence that people have come up with that wherever Alexander the Great conquered, he stood up these stelae with the exact same sayings of the sages on them. And they found one, on the boundaries of India, and they found one in Central Asia. And that wasn't all he was doing. He was in every place. He was building a theater, he was building a gymnasia, he was building all of the accoutrements of a Greek city-state across this entire area. So the point that Burton Mack makes is, in the earlier stages of the classical era, the Greeks would go find some low populated area situated on a river mouth or someplace where there was a silver mine or what have you, and they'd set up a new polis. And they could do that because there were so many semi-inhabited parts of the world. There were places to go. But by the time you get to Alexander the Great, his focus has shifted from empty places to full places. He's looking for places that already have an existing culture and a politic that's working for the people who are there. And he's going to go in and just crush it and destroy it and replace it with his own ideals of how civilization's supposed to work. And Max says, although we praise how exciting it is that one guy led this movement to create the world's largest empire to date, from the perspective of the defeated peoples, this was the worst thing that had ever happened to them. Their churches were broken, their temples were broken, their old social political relationships were broken, their philosophies of life, their worldviews were broken. And they're all now swirling around in this melting pot that Alexander has created. They're all talking to each other. There's refugees moving from here to there. They're setting up little community churches, of the kind of religion that they used to have 75 years ago before they were, defeated. What happens to the Jews after the Romans defeat Judea and tear down the temple has already happened. Before it happens to the Jews, it's already happened to everybody else from the Mediterranean to the boundaries of India. And so Max says, this is partially why all these people speak multiple languages. They're familiar with at least what you might call the Hollywood version of each other's religions and each other's histories. It's shallow, but it covers a lot of ground. The average person could recite, they knew about some of the gods and stories of Egypt. They knew about some of the gods and stories of Babylon, some of the gods and stories of Persia. All these things are swirling around in people's heads. And the same is true for their philosophies. How does God work? How does nature work? How does man work? You have all these people who have these magpie shiny collections of bits and pieces of dozens of cultures, because dozens of cultures have just been uprooted in the previous centuries and cast adrift. And they're all swirling around trying to find a new way to live, a new way to exist. How are you supposed to make a people when you're a whole bunch of scattered refugees? That's the problem confronting people in Galilee and elsewhere throughout the Middle East during this time. It's the old picture of a coherent, unified Israel that had held itself together, and everybody was a monotheist and everybody was a Jew, and they might have internal politics, but it was one coherent group. He says that might be true of Judea, but it's not true of anywhere else. Well, it might be true of Samaria, even more so, but it's not true of anywhere else. Everybody else is in this free-flowing swirl of refugees and cosmopolitan cross-cultural currents. And that's the context in which Jesus starts preaching. You know, it's like, yeah, there's poverty, there's dislocation, there's confusion, but there's a lot of cosmopolitanism that's been forced upon them by Alexander the Great and the Seleucid empires. And I hadn't been clear on that. All my reading in Mac is yesterday and today. And I hope to finish it today and tomorrow. I wasn't clear on any of this, but as I read it, it fits into the pictures of the archaeology that I do have. And I'm like, that makes more sense than what I thought before. So should we do a little bit of Q and then turn to Kenneth? Maybe we'll do 14 minutes of Q here just to get started, and then we'll dive into Kenneth. Let's actually look at some of the text. Most of it is going to look familiar. I'm just warning you. You've seen it in Matthew and Luke. This is the stuff. This is either the stuff that's in common between Matthew and Luke that they didn't get from Mark, or it's things that maybe only Matthew has, or maybe only Luke has. But man, it sounds exactly like the stuff they have in common, and so it's probably also from Q. That's how the scholars selected. So here's what we've got. I'm just gonna start dropping some fragments in there. They speculate that it would have started with something like, these are the teachings of Jesus, because that's typically how these sayings collections opened. But they don't know. They don't have any evidence for that part. And that's not something that Matthew or Luke would have copied, because they already had their own openings. All of this stuff I'm pasting, this is going to sound familiar. It's also going to sound different because it's out of context. Matthew and Luke have repurposed all this material to fit into their narrative story or biography of Jesus. But it appears that in the original way that it appeared in Q, it wasn't really part of a biography. It was mostly a collection of sayings and parables and incidents. And you can see that in the flow or lack of flow between this material. I'm just going to keep dropping some of it in there. Feel free to scan it. The links I provided earlier will give you a way to look at it. If you follow the third link I provided above and just read the bold stuff, that's what this is. This is just the Q1 layer. Before they started editing Q further. And I'll do a little bit more. I mean, I know Sharon's reading this going, yep, I saw that. Yep, I read that. Yep, this is familiar. It's like, this is the stuff, right? But when you take it out of the context of Matthew and Luke, it changes. And especially when you take it out of the context of the eschatology or the end times or what have you, it becomes different. When it's just a series of sayings, it's different. It feels different. Because now it's not playing a supporting role where it's supporting a story or a theology. Now it's standing on its own. They would have had, they believe, books in the same way that in the medieval period, people would carry around books of Psalms or Proverbs, and it didn't have any of the rest of the Bible, just the Psalms or just the Proverbs. They think that in the decade after Jesus's death, people would carry around these little books of sayings. Here's the stuff that Jesus said. And, a little bit of it, maybe, I think that, what do they think? About 30% overlaps with Thomas. So that's two different testimonials that suggest this was a stage, and that's the last. It ends with this stuff about salt. And that it testifies to an early stage of Christianity that was really focused on Jesus as a sage, as a teacher. And the wisdom literature, and how can we follow his example? What is he exhorting us to do? Sharon, go ahead. You wanted to add something?
I just want to ask a question, because the general theme is there, but the general idea is there. Much of this is the difference is due to translation, interpretation.
Yes.
The language.
Yes.
Right, because you can change around a few words and change the meaning of a sentence, and therefore
right.
the implication of the thought.
That's right.
Right. So it looks very, very similar, but I was just wondering the impact of translation on this Gospel of Q, or if Q was the foundation for some of the Gospels in the Bible, then was it just translated differently? That's my question.
Yeah, and Mac's hypothesis, in the fourth part of his book, he talks about how does this material get used by Mark, Matthew, Luke, and Thomas? What were their goals? What were they trying to accomplish? And part of the conclusion that he reaches is that it's not that anybody set out with malice to distort the words of Jesus. It's that the communities writing in 75 or 80 or 90 or 120, they had different concerns. And among them was the fall of the Temple of Jerusalem, right? When Jesus is writing, that's not a problem. The Temple of Jerusalem is doing fine. They're not writing in a period of crisis where they've lost the center of Jewish religion. But by the time Mark's writing, they have lost it. It's down. And Judaism is in a crisis like it hasn't known in a long time. And there's no way that Mark, Matthew, or Luke can ignore that crisis. They can't just pretend that that's not happening. They have to write about it. And so with that on their minds, when they read Q, they see something different in it than we do. And they see something different in it than the Q community would have seen in 40. It's just like you're saying. There's translation, but there's also this broader question of perspective and what's on your mind when you look at something. That Greek epistemological idea that Heraclitus says it, man is not rational. Only what encompasses him is rational. Human nature has no true understanding. Only the divine nature has it. And it's because we're possessed by enthusiasms. Whatever our enthusiasm is at the moment, as honest as we can be, everything is still funhouse mirror transformed to fit the frame of that enthusiasm that has us in its grip. And that kind of deep level of understanding of human psyche and epistemology is maybe not something that the writers are thinking about. Now, Beverly has a history major, and she says one of the things that they studied in college is the idea that what we think of as history didn't exist at all until the modern age. Nobody set out to write. Nobody sat down and said, what actually happened in so-and-so's life is sacred and I must get every jot and tittle of it right. Nobody said that. And we know because when that emerged as a new theory of history, it was enormously controversial and people fought hard against it. Before that, people thought the purpose of history was to teach lessons. And if you had to put your thumb on the scales, then put your thumb on the scales. You got to teach the lesson. That's the whole point. Why would you even mention history if you weren't trying to teach a lesson? And so what people said and what people did, the concepts of biography and history, they were nothing like what we do now. They were like, what does my community need to hear today? What is the challenge that we're facing today in this place? And how can I leverage the things that I've been exposed to before in order to make the point these guys need to hear in order to hold our community together? That was it. That was the focus. And if that meant that they had to, from a modern perspective, we assume that that means that they then decided, I'm going to compromise Jesus's words. But that's not what they thought they were doing. They literally thought they were, telling you what Jesus said, because in their moment of passion about the current circumstances, they could only remember what Jesus said in that light, in that way. They lacked the self-criticism that would be required to say, I know I'm really excited and angry about the fall of the temple, but I have to be careful not to attribute that to Jesus. That kind of separation of self into a schism of two parts was not something that people, not only did it not come naturally, they didn't even think it would be a good thing to do. And so you get an enormous amount of drift in the message over time based on what people are excited or worried or concerned about. Stephen, oh yeah, well, Jim Rothweiler posts could anyone here be on the first few rows? That's a reference to Monty Python and the Life of Brian, which has that fantastic opening scene with Jesus standing to do the Sermon on the Mount where he's going, blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek. And we start up with him speaking, and the camera just pulls back and pulls back and pulls back through the crowd, and his voice gets fainter and fainter until eventually the murmuring of the crowd and the breathing of the people next to you is louder than what Jesus is trying to say. And they're going, what did he say? Did you hear what he said? And the one guy goes, Blessed are the cheesemakers. Well, that makes sense, but he probably doesn't just mean cheesemakers, but all the purveyors of the dairy arts. They're doing their best to understand what they're not really hearing in the back rows. And it's you're sitting there going, "Oh God, this is terrible." But then a woman goes, "Oh, the meek, blessed are the meek." Oh, that's nice. They've had such a rough time of it. It's like somebody got a piece of the message through all the chaos and confusion of the circumstances. So, Jim, thank you for sharing that. Once again, that cynic Tom Lehrer, mischievous lesson thing. Monty Python was all over that with Life of Brian. Then they got in an enormous amount of trouble. It's hard for us to believe today, but boy, did they get in a lot of trouble for Life of Brian. It was banned in multiple countries. You're not supposed to say funny things about the time of Jesus, which is funny because Jesus was saying funny things on purpose, trying to get people to question the established order, right? Humor is not forbidden. It just has to be used appropriately. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, this is one that I've wondered a long time about. Like I said, I've gone a bit into history and getting the mentality of history in ancient times. Now, the big guy who presented that to us was Mr. N, wasn't it? When he said, Mr. N, the big N, you know who I'm talking about, when he said in ancient times they had the master morality. You guys are all off on the slave morality. That's you go back to ancient times, I'd say, oh, you want to be a slave, do you? There's plenty of room for more. Here's your chains. Now that number 44 of the Sermon on the Mount, when I look at history, love your enemy, pray for those who persecute you. That's just not happening. That doesn't seem to be in the earliest documents. That's an add-in. Later on, around the time that Christianity becomes an official religion, there's the other one. It's like turn the other cheek. And I've broached this with, Christians, and they can't accept it. Their idea is you just keep on being slapped and that's to the glory of God. Yeah, well, your Christianity won't be around very long if you adopt that strategy. Now, I've looked at ancient stories and ancient documents, and what persistently comes up is the art of the duel when you're in conflict with other people. And, like I said, you ran into Peter, he's quite likely to punch you in the face. He wasn't a softie. This is the thing that in their culture, when they said, these cultures, when they said, turn the other cheek, the challenge to the duel was this. In a sense, you're slapped or you're assaulted. And what Jesus was saying was give the other guy the benefit of the doubt. You say to the other guy, do you really want to go in that direction? Is there something more reasonable? And then he slaps you again, then the fight is on. This is a time when you had to be tough with people and you had to fight people or you're going under. If you want to keep your scratch of beach like Peter, you're going to have a few near-on punch-ups with people. Modern people don't understand this. They live in a soft society. This is the thing. So, yeah, I'm very sure that what Jesus was saying, somebody slaps you once, turn the other cheek and give them the benefit of the doubt. Give them the chance to change their approach. But certainly you're not going to stand around and be slapped in the face for eternity. You have to protect yourself at a certain point. But you tell this to the modern Christians and that they think it's glorious to be slapped in the face forever. And therefore, God up there will punish the bad guy. And I will be exalted because I let myself be slapped around. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. There's some interesting discussion, because that's right up front in the ones that I just shared. Is the bit about turning the cheek, and Burton Mack talks about that and says, yeah, this is one of those things that can be interpreted, dozens of different ways. Says, but when you look at it outside the context of Matthew and Luke, when you look at it as an old layer of Q, as maybe being standing by itself in an original group of sayings, the context here is, how are you going to be a wandering preacher who who is mischievous and questioning authority and questioning corruption and trying to expose people's hypocrisy? How are you going to do that? You're not going to do it by punching them. You're going to do it by the devastating repartee verbally. You know, the you this is a Hellenized world in which there's a tradition for centuries of people like Diogenes wandering the roads from village to village and town to town, making their living doing this basically philosophical comedy. They're countercultural critics of the status quo, and they're at this point a recognized group. They've been a recognized group for some time. He quotes the Stoics and the Epicureans as both having, they have a lot of praise for the Cynics. And as you know, Stoicism is a big deal in the Roman Empire. They said they admire Diogenes and the rest of the Cynics. They said their ability to think on their feet, to see to the heart of the morality in a situation and find the contradictions and the humor and point it out in a way that's easy for the crowd to hear and understand and make them question the corruption and the morality and the accepted stands. And they say all of this depends on, when the guy tries to get you into a fight, you fight him verbally. Your whole shtick is, yeah, if you want to be a thug, you can do that, but now you've lost the argument. And the entire the guy who tries to come and hit you while you're standing in the marketplace, they're all listening to what a great speaker you are and how you're cutting to the core of how to be a good human being. This guy comes up and tries to stop you with his fists, and the whole crowd's going to laugh at that guy. You go, what are you, a brute? Are you an animal? Says if you were going to be a warrior, you were expected to be a smart warrior. You were expected to be just as good with your tongue as you were with your sword. And the cynic is saying, I'm so good with my tongue, I don't even need the sword. Go ahead, tell me, come here, try to oppress me, and I will reveal the corruption and the hypocrisy in what you're doing, and the whole crowd will be on my side and not your side. So this is a really different angle from, just slap me around and I'll take it and that's fine. This is about, if you want to play this role in society, you can't be tricked into lowering yourself to the level of brute force. You have to always be quick on your feet with your tongue. You have to see penetratingly into what's happening in the situation, the psychology, the morality. Why is it happening the way it does? And you have to find that thread of conversation that's going to change everything. He says, yeah. And the reason we know this is that this isn't the only example we have. There are rule books for cynics that have been floating around that were written during these centuries. And they say the same thing. They say, if you're going to be a great comedian, you have to know how to respond to heckling. This is basically rules on how to handle heckling.
Okay, but in a world of conflict.
In a world of conflict, yeah.
That's the question. Do you give the other person the benefit of the doubt?
Right.
Because what we're seeing presently in our world of the conflict is the opposite of that.
Everyone assumes the worst right off the bat.
Yeah. Well, we
Yeah.
used to have the benefit of the doubt. It was
Right.
there 50 years ago. Now the law is being used as a weapon
Yes.
to achieve power. This is how the Roman Republic fell apart.
Yes.
When the law ceased to be one that was trying to improve the situation, to where those seeking power got into power and used the law as a weapon.
Yes.
That's the very undoing of the law.
Yes.
Once you start doing that, your state is going out the window.
Yeah.
And if it survives in any form, it's going to be replaced by something absolutely authoritarian.
Which we know is coming to Judea. It's not here yet when he's saying these things, but it's coming.
And you better watch out, because the absolute authoritarian might not be the one that you wished,
That's right.
because there's several different types. For example, socialism. Donald Trump is a socialist, if you care to notice. That's where he came from. He's a socialist. Adolf Hitler was a socialist. Benito Mussolini was a socialist. The socialists are in different forms. People imagine, socialism is, I don't know, the Democratic Party. But there's the other side of socialism as well. Fascism is socialist. And if we're heading into a world of socialism, watch out which version you're getting.
But that's a material we'll get into in the modern epoch. Not so much an issue for Jesus's time. Yeah, it's interesting, how the context, as Sharon was saying, part of it's about an issue of translation, part of it's an issue of interpretation, and part of it's an issue of context. What sentences came before this sentence? What sentences come after this sentence? It changes everything. And putting Paul's epistles after the Gospels in the New Testament changes how we read Paul's epistles. And so, as Max says, the challenge for us in understanding Q is we take these things out of Matthew and Luke and put them back into their original sequence without the interpretive material around them that's causing us to read it a certain way. What picture of the world emerges of Jesus and his time and his teachings? And it's a challenge to us. And it's the same kind of challenge that Kenneth Smith is asking us to do in this book, right? Because the challenge is, can we learn to see from multiple perspectives? And can we modulate between them and look at the same thing from different angles and go, maybe it's not the case that one perspective is always right. maybe for some truths, I need multiple perspectives at the exact same time, because each of them is showing some things, but also hiding some things, or warping some things, but showing other things clearly. And it's only when I piece it together like a mosaic that I can start to see the thing itself. And that's what it's like trying to get to the historical Jesus. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I want to follow up on something that Stephen said, which is very apt. He said it's the undoing of the law. And that, I think, was the whole problem with Jesus, the whole issue, not a problem, with Jesus and the chief scribes and elders. Because when Jesus came, his teachings were different. If you get slapped on one cheek, you turn the other cheek. And that kind of forgiveness, and I don't want to say forgiveness and compassion, but that kind of difference from the old law, from the laws in the Old Testament, was very different from what Jesus was saying. And over time, the chief priests and elders developed a lot of anxiety about Jesus's presence and his teachings. And it leads right up to right up to the crucifixion, when Pilate tried him and he says, well, I don't find anything with him. The crowd responded, crucify him, because they were so anxious about the change that he was bringing. Right. So it was the undoing of the law. Even though there are people who believe there's a thought that Jesus was fulfilling a prophecy, it was still disrupting the status quo, and that disruption caused the problem.
Thank you, Sharon. Yeah, it's something we're going to get into, especially starting next week when we start to look at Q2, the second layer that was added a few decades later, because then they start to be concerned with eschatology and with the issues of, are you with me or are you against me? Are you persecuting me? Those things, if you notice in this stuff that I've shared here today, it's almost entirely missing. There's nothing here about the cross, resurrection, salvation. There's nothing, there's very little here even about confronting the priests in Jerusalem. This is really a, kind of code of conduct. And it comes across very differently. But next week we'll do the second layer and things begin to change. So for now, I thought I'd turn us to the text, to Kenneth Smith. And now that we've had our little Q intro, and I hope that you can see that by looking at this stuff about Q, it reinforces what Kenneth Smith said earlier in this chapter, that the early Christianity was not concerned with rewards and punishments. It was concerned with how to be a good person. And it's a completely different focus. There's no heaven or hell really to speak of here. There's some brief discussions of the kingdom of God, but all the stuff about the kingdom of God strongly suggests, like we saw in Thomas, that it's already here and that it's in how we behave and treat one another. That's the kingdom of God, not we die and we get a pie in the sky. That is a later formulation of the theology. And that was Kenneth Smith's point. And that's why I'm sharing this stuff, right? All this stuff sort of reinforces, even though he hasn't quoted from Q in this book, the quoting from Q reinforces the point. You know, we see that indeed these early Christians had very different concerns from the medieval preoccupation of heaven and hell. So let's go back to Kenneth's text, and we'll start with paragraph 16. We did the end of paragraph 16 last time, but it was at the end of the session, so I'll just drop it in there again. The sufferings of this world and everyday soulish strife were no longer sufficient to drive men to the consolations of religion. For not every year or month was a time of war, plague, or grief. But hellfire and damnation were, however speculative, truly perennial matters of concern. The church's authority clenched itself to become more ironclad and totalitarian, less moral or spiritual. And as you may recall from paragraph 16, 15, 14, this is the theme here, is about if you are a house church or a community of people who are trying to take care of each other and have authenticity and to try to be honest and moral, then the emphasis of the church is going to look one way. But if what you're trying to do is make the world's most powerful church and become a religious empire, then your focus becomes very different. And Kenneth's argument leading up to these sentences was that the church was faced with a temptation they couldn't resist. Like, if you would just change your focus to become appetitive and make people concerned about pain and pleasure, you can have the pleasure of heaven or you can have the pain of hell, and say it's inescapable, you have to choose. And if you want to avoid the stick and you want the carrot, then you're going to have to follow us. You know, that represents an enormous transformation in the message, you know, from the message of Jesus to the message of the medieval church. And it is somewhat, what do I want to say? It's one of the differences Robert McKee talks about in story between a plot and a story, is that in a plot, it's just one thing happens, then another thing happens, then another thing happens, the end, it's over. It's a roller coaster ride. This was the exciting part, this was the sad part, this is the end. But in a story, it comes from your character. It is your character and your wants and your desires and the things that you're striving for that cause you to change your understanding over time. As you act, you know, to try to secure your desires based on your initial imperfect understanding, you're surprised to discover the world doesn't cooperate with you. You say, I took what I thought was a reasonable action, and I thought it would get me the good thing, but instead I got the opposite of the good thing. Something must be wrong here. And McKee says in the early stages of a story, nobody wants to challenge their understanding. So instead they say, I must have just had the wrong strategy. And so they try various strategies until finally they triangulate upon the truth that they don't want to acknowledge, but they're forced into, which is none of these strategies are getting me what I want. There's something wrong with what I want or with how I think the world works, or both. And it provokes a crisis in the character, that they're forced to question their understanding of themselves and the world. And it's only by going through that crisis that they can change their desires and start to have goals that are more appropriate to who they really are and who the world really is. And that's how the story ends. Like with Oedipus, he finally understands his story. You know, until he understands his story, nothing goes right. It's not until he gets it but that he's able to bring the miasma of Thebes to an end at great personal cost, of course. Terrible personal cost. But so what we see in the story of the early church is that at first they're not concerned with spreading all over the world, right? It's a religion for a number of like-minded people who have a certain code of conduct and they want to behave a certain way. But as they begin to build up power and come into conflict with the authorities, now they get new goals, which is how do I not get persecuted by the Roman Empire? How do I not get persecuted by this other group? And so questions of how do I accumulate the power? This is kind of what Stephen is alluding to in the comments. How do I accumulate the power that's necessary to withstand all of these traumas? Well, the natural, that naturally suggests a transformation in your understanding of your own theology and value system. Because if you don't do that, if you only had the value system that's described in this earliest layer of Q, you're never going to be able to make a religious empire. That's not what this Burton Mack talks about this a great deal. He says, we're used to the idea that Jesus is confronting the establishment of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, but there's really none of that in this first layer of Q. That gets added later. And certainly there's nothing here that says the world will only know peace when our version of the religion is spread over the whole world and there aren't any other religions. That medieval conception. That's not here either. That all comes later, and it's the consequence of the goals changing under pressure and under trauma. And we'll get to this stuff next week, but we can't underestimate the degree of trauma when the Romans destroyed the Temple of Jerusalem. I mean, that just shocked the Middle East in a huge way. And the thing about trauma is it causes a reaction. All right, so let's move on to the new paragraph, paragraph 17. We didn't cover any of this last week. He says, and as Nietzsche realized, the big N realized, the church extended its power of intimidation deeper and deeper into the ranks of irrational psyches. Not just the spiritually volatile or discontent. The church changed its own shape by reaching into the douloi or slavish, who live and reason solely by emotion and appetite. Extorting obedience and donations had become the sole consideration. Now he's describing the late Middle Ages. Right? We're jumping ahead, from the 1st century CE, we're jumping into the 1200s, 1300s, 1400s. That the obedience no longer had spiritual but only animal motivations was immaterial. And so the end of, quote, salvation justified the means of terrorism in the strictest sense of the term, rule by fear. So I don't know how many of you have read Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Oh, nice. Yeah, it's humor. It's Alfred E. Newman. It's Tom Lehrer. These are his on the one hand pretending to be writing a normal story, but on the other hand, man, is it social critique. And he's got some bits in there where he's talking about the friars or monks or nuns who are going along on the journey, and they are some of the least spiritual, most corrupted, worldly people ever. They're into admiring the sex appeal of the people they're walking with, or who's got money, or what have you. And that's because by the time Chaucer's writing, the church has fallen a long way from where it was centuries before. When Kenneth is talking about this sort of dropping to the point of just merely animal motivation in order to collect donations and obedience, he's describing this late stage of the Middle Ages. And it's not an original insight to him. Everybody is talking almost openly. I mean, Chaucer is talking about it openly, about how contemptible it's getting. And it's gonna get worse for a few more centuries, but it's gonna culminate in a need for change, for revolution. They're creating by going to the lowest common denominator and losing the spirit that motivated the religion in the first place. They're removing the reason for the religion to exist at all. And it is that other half of the medieval dialectic, the people who are trying to be true to Jesus all along, who are not going to tolerate that outcome. And they're going to say, rather than have the church go away, it's time to reform the church. The church is just broken and we need to start over again, get it right. So he's alluding to all of that here. He continues and in paragraph 17. We have many salacious and sadistic accounts from the church fathers about the tortures of the damned. Even Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, a late medieval, speaks of the blessed's view of the eternally miserable in hell as being a chief source of bliss for them to enjoy from heaven. Summa Theologica. He gives you the reference. He wants you to know he's not making this up. Thomas Aquinas himself said, well, what are the pleasures of heaven? I'll tell you, it's enjoying, fantasizing about the pain and torment of the people in hell. That's why you'll be happy in heaven. You'll be sitting there going, isn't it great how much they're burning? Isn't it great how miserable they are and how they suffer? This is Thomas Aquinas. That's his view of heaven. Schadenfreude, right? It's the people who cheer and clap at the auto da fe or the witch burning. Yay, suffer, you suffer over there. Because I'm not suffering. When we were kids and they would say, finish your spinach, think of the starving kids in China. And we never understood. And we always said, well, why can't the kids in China eat my spinach? And that's because we were misunderstanding the moral incompetence of the people of the generations before us who were relishing the starvation in China. What's great about America is we're not starving like those suckers in China. Whoa, it sucks to be them. Isn't it great that they suffer and we don't? This is the zero-sum picture of history. I'm not a winner unless somebody else is losing, and I relish their defeat. That's what gives me the joy in victory. And this is the morality of Thomas Aquinas on display in his picture of heaven. Now, you watch modern films about heaven, and none of them show people up there gleefully rubbing their hands going, suffer, you bastards, suffer. Nobody now thinks, in Hollywood anyway, nobody thinks that's an attractive picture of heaven. But Thomas Aquinas, this is not some weirdo in a writing, hopped up on rye in a monastery, because this is one of the lead theologians of his era, speaking for an entire zeitgeist. It is the zeitgeist that the torment is the joy. And now, if you think about, think about Michelangelo's painting, right? Not the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the back wall of the Sistine Chapel that shows people being tortured in hell, including a pope he didn't like, right? And they're all being tortured in hell. And that's Michelangelo agreeing with Aquinas and getting off on the torments of the damned. Think about Dante, the Divine Comedy. Dante, more than Harold Bloom has hilarious things to say about Dante in the Western canon. Says Dante is from our perspective is a real weirdo. I mean, he's got this serious medieval preoccupation with, life just isn't complete unless the sinners are being tortured. And I want to know all about the torture. I mean, I want to know that every torture is exactly precisely calibrated to the sin of the sinner. It's like there was a series of films that came out recently, and now I can't remember the name of them, about a guy who would capture past wrongdoers and put them in these torture devices. Saw, the Saw series, of horror films, and a lot of people are like, well, that's torture porn. It's gross. I mean, I sure I'll watch Godzilla stomp on Tokyo, but I do not want to watch people sawing off their own legs. That's gross. But that's because we aren't getting into the medieval perspective. If we were Thomas Aquinas, we'd be like, Saw, yes. If we were Dante, we were like, I want to see the torture of the sinners. I need them. I need them to hurt. I'm into it. And if you're looking for something a million miles away from the Q1 strata of Q, the wisdom teachings, the love one another teachings, it is what has happened by the late Middle Ages to the theology, that it is, so excited about inflicting pain. And there is a line that goes directly from, as a result, that goes directly from Augustine, who noted with wonder that he said, I might not agree with torturing people into conversion, but I wonder at how effective it is. It's just marvelous how effective it is when you torture people until they convert. You go from that to Aquinas, who's like, the torture in hell is the point of heaven. That's the joy you can have. And then that leads directly into the Inquisition. You can see why Torquemada is like, well, of course, torturing your body, that's a small price. Those days or hours of pain are a small price to pay for the chance that I might save your soul from hell. Of course, I'm going to pull out your teeth and your fingernails. Of course. Your body doesn't matter. What matters is your eternal soul. right? Don't you want to go up to heaven with me and enjoy the torments of the damned, looking down on hell? I mean, I gotta help you get there so that we can watch TV together, bro. That'll be our football game, is watching these guys break their necks. So Kenneth Smith continues, did the church honestly warn its quivering flocks how feeble the odds were in their favor to gamble for eternal blessedness? Salvandorum paucitas, damnadorum multitudo. Few are saved, many are damned, according to Aquinas. The ratio is as that of Noah's family to the rest of humanity. And this is what Kenneth is interested in these paragraphs and in these chapters. He wants to look at the Hegelian model of history and say, what forces would it take? What historical, political, economic, what contingencies could account for the transformation from the message love one another to the message relish the torments of the damned? It is a massive ironic transformation over the course of 1,500 years to get to that point. And it doesn't happen by accident. It's not as simple as things rot, so it rotted. Hegel says it's not that simple. There were forces at work, and the church had to struggle to navigate those forces. And as it did, it unfolded from within itself the latent order of its own character. Seeds that were in there that seemed negligible early on grew into gigantic oaks by the late stages. And some of those oaks bore bitter fruit. Let's go on to paragraph 18. See, and I might be spending over half the time talking about Q, but we are doing some serious Kenneth, right? And we're going through a lot of text here. So paragraph 18, just as in Platonism, the philosopher king has turned aside from the sublime contemplation of ideal truths in order to leaven some understanding of justice into human affairs. So too in Buddhism, the bodhisattva spurns nirvana for the sake of helping others. So he's talking here about compassion in Platonism, and he's talking about compassion in Buddhism. He says, Christianity, however, does not know such selflessness with regard to heaven. And of course, he's overstating his case here, right? He's assuming you remember the context. Late medieval Christianity does not know such selflessness with regard to heaven. Heaven is the only conceivable choice a sane Christian can make, not earth or hell. But heaven is a blessedness strictly for one's own sake. Can I be saved? Because who the hell would want to be stuck in hell, given the picture that's being painted of it? This is what he meant by terrorism earlier. You're getting to this point where you're terrifying people into doing the things that are required for them to avoid the terrible catastrophe that you say awaits them for all eternity, unless they get everything exactly right. It is a kind of existential pressure on the psyche that Homo sapiens never evolved to handle. And this is a point that Kenneth makes in the modern section. So I'm just going to foreshadow, right? The problem with a dog-eat-dog relentless competition marketplace is that in the realm of nature, that's not how things work. And I don't know how many people have spent much time in the woods, but most of the time it's pretty quiet. You are not relentlessly being pounced on by leopards. There aren't that many leopards in the world. The world couldn't support that many leopards. It just doesn't work that way. And even a leopard, sometimes, like if it had cubs and they died and it's still full of those maternal hormones, sometimes it'll adopt a bunny rabbit and raise it to adulthood. I mean, there's more going on in nature than red of tooth and nail. Red of tooth and nail is a part of the picture. It's a part of the dialectic, but nature is also a realm in which things harmonize. And love is part of that picture. Love and predation coexist in an uncomfortable way in nature, but the consequence is you can spend enormous amounts of time in nature never having a predator to think about. The purpose of the stress hormones like adrenaline is not that you are endlessly keyed up to the top of your maximal efficiency in order to be some kind of ubermensch who outcompetes the rest of the world. Nature loves to eat you. Nature also loves you to eat it, right? It's also producing berries like relentlessly. It's both things happening at the same time. So the result is biologically, physiologically, we are keyed up to where stress hormones like adrenaline are outstandingly useful in short doses, small doses for short periods of time. You need the adrenaline while you're running from the tiger. But after you've left the tiger and you get back to your village, the adrenaline fades and you take a nap. And if the adrenaline doesn't fade, you can't take a nap. And if you don't sleep, you gradually go psychotic within three to 8 days. I mean, we are really designed to rest and sleep. And the reason that we are designed to rest and sleep plenty is because the world, as scary as it can be, is not so relentlessly scary that we have to always be on our guard. We're not designed for that. So the medieval focus on at any moment you could misstep and spend eternity being tortured. And we want to keep you riveted on obedience and doing what we tell you to do, is putting people into a situation that basically drives people insane. We're not meant to have that much adrenaline for our entire life. That's not supposed to happen. I mean, any medical professional will tell you. Adrenaline is the pepper of life. It can improve a dish in small amounts, but if all you're eating is spoonfuls of pepper, you're going to be miserable. You're not going to be okay, right? And it's the same with the modern world. You want the way the marketplace works to be that there are times for competition and there are times for relaxation. We need both halves of the dialectic. You can't try to keep people keyed up to maximum efficiency. So this is the subtext of what he's talking about here, is that Buddhism and Platonism both recognized that you have to have this dialectic. Yes, you have to take care of yourself. Maybe you put your mask on first, but then you turn to your neighbor and help them put their mask on. You don't just say, ha ha, you're suffocating to death. I get to be the sole survivor of this airplane. You don't do that. That is not how we are designed to work. Anything that tries to maximize your focus on only me, and there can be only one, there's something wrong with it. If you've never seen the film Highlander, it's from the 1980s, starred Christopher Lambert. Famously, it has, what's his name, who played James Bond? Sean Connery is one of the characters in it. And it's a film about these people who are immortal beings who cut off each other's heads. They're great swordsmen who have lived for thousands of years, and they cut off each other's head and cut off the other guy's head. All his power flows into you, and you become more powerful. And the end game is there can be only one. And they say it over and over, there can be only one. There can be only one. I mean, they're all talking about it all the time. And it is in some ways the model for genocide. It's like turning genocide into a simple, easy to understand parable of why it doesn't work. Eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. If there can be only one, then there won't be any. It takes a community to make these things happen. Competition has to exist alongside cooperation in a dialectic. So he's saying that Platonism and Buddhism gets that. He's saying that late stage Christianity, not today, but in the late medieval period, has lost it, and that by forcing people to choose heaven, by saying this isn't about being a good person or doing the right thing, this is about avoiding physical bodily torment, they're sucking all the moral sophistication, all the capacity to be a good person has been removed from it. And now it's become a matter of stripped down dog eat dog survival, in which there is no morality, there's no capacity to be good. And this is why the church becomes so corrupt in the late Middle Ages. It's operating on entirely the wrong level. So next up, sentences 3 through 5, paragraph 18. A Christian may certainly want to share the prospects of heaven with others, just as his spirituality will make him altruistic and eager to help men in their worldly afflictions. But both of these godly works only ensure his own place in heaven. When you construct a theology that says, be good to other people so that you go to heaven, you have sucked the soul out of Jesus's teachings, which is the reason to love one another and treat one another, with kindness, is because it's the right thing to do, not because otherwise I hit you with the hell stick. It's because this is how you become a better person. And if you think clearly, and incisively about the questions of what do I need, what do other people need, how do we balance these needs, the act of struggling through these questions will help you grow up. Medical ethics, Sharon, right? Medical ethics. They teach classes on medical ethics not to give you the answer, but to teach you how to think about problems like this. And the more you learn how to do the thinking, the more morally sophisticated a human being you become. And that's a big part of what Jesus was trying to teach. Not do this or I'll hit you. Right? If you reduce this to do this or I'll hit you, the capacity to do critical thinking about morality and balancing people's needs, it atrophies. Because there's really no question of those things. You just do what you're forced to do. The end. It is using Stephen's terminology, teaching people do it or I'll hit you, is teaching them the slave morality. That's where the slave morality comes from. You don't need to develop as a human being. You don't need to strive to be better. You don't need to dilate your mind to encompass the larger reality and the complications. You just need to shut up and do what I say. That infantilizes people. It makes them slaves inside, regardless of whether they have a shackle on them outside. So the only way, this is part of Nietzsche's paradox about slave mentality versus master mentality. The only way to develop the master mentality is through your ability to wrestle with these questions in a sophisticated way. You need the practice of struggling to understand how to balance different needs and desires. Without that practice, those muscles atrophy, and you become self-infantilizing. So take care, Geneva. Great to see you. Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
That's a really important point. Just briefly, so far as that, it's more that if you're tying yourself to the outcome and you're looking for the reward, then you lose the benefit of what the act actually is yielding. Meaning, if you do it for the reason in and of itself, and you don't necessarily do it for the reward, then you are tying yourself to the outcome. And if you tie yourself to the outcome of something, that you will likely be disappointed, and you're probably unlikely to, maybe you'll even say that's good enough at some point. And as opposed to actually seeing it as something that this is what I'm supposed to do. So there's an element of authenticity, but there's also this deeper understanding that you gain, is that there's a certain degree of freedom that comes along with that, that you're, that you're helping someone and that are doing whatever the right thing to do in a particular situation, even though it may even be difficult, that it's a way of having this, well, you really have a deeper understanding of what it is really good. And so, that's, and so anyway, there, and that becomes self-sustaining, because if you're doing it for that reason, then you're just obviously able to, continue to do it because it's part of who you are, as opposed to you're doing it for the reward, and maybe, you may do it at some point, you may not do it at another point, but it becomes part of your character. And so, and then people often kind of forget that. They think, and if you think about people that sometimes they don't act virtuously. They're acting in a way that they feel is in their interests, so that they're trying to, they're trying to game you in order to get whatever they want out of the situation. If they're doing an act in order to get a reward, they're trying to game you to get something that they want, as opposed to doing it because you understand it's the right thing to do and that's who you are. Anyway, it's a very important point, because this is where sometimes people, if you have a debate with somebody about the afterlife as to what is meaningful, you can find meaning in the act, but you don't have to find meaning in the afterlife. So that actually brings meaning to your everyday life.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, I'm going to cross you with Stephen here, because there's a part of what you're saying is something that Stephen talks about too. The problem with an empty participation trophy. It's one thing for little kids, but when the adult world is organized that way, you get situations where if someone has always been rewarded consistently every time they did the thing you want, the very first time they don't get rewarded, it's a catastrophe for them. And we know this from psychological studies. If people are working for the reward, it's the wrong goal. If you're trying to develop in somebody a resilience, they need to be resilient even when they're not getting an immediate reward. They need to understand that the reason for doing the thing is not to get the cookie right now. You do the thing because it develops who you are as a person, so that you can, do the thing even under trying circumstances. It gives you survival value and vitality value to be able to stand up under adversity. And if you're always getting a cookie every time, then what you have is a fragile strength. It looks strong on the outside because you're consistently doing the right thing right up until the very first moment you don't get the reward. And now all of a sudden your entire moral framework falls to pieces. So one way to think about it is, the reason the cheetah is so fast is not so that it can catch the gazelle. It did evolve for that reason, but that's not the payoff. The payoff, yeah, Ari's talking about reward circuitry. Here we go. That's exactly right. The payoff for the cheetah is the running itself. It is a joy to run for the cheetah. And because it's a joy to run, the cheetah will keep running and keep practicing and keep trying it until it gets better and better at running. And someday it's going to be able to catch the gazelle. Right? But if the payoff was the gazelle the very first time, and not the running, if running was just awful and they just wanted the gazelle, the very first time they run and don't catch a gazelle, they give up. What's the point of all this running anyway if it's not going to give me a gazelle? Now, evolution recognizes that, and this is what Kenneth is kind of alluding to in this, that if you're trying to organize a survival skill or behavior in a species, the motivation can't be so shallow as I got the trophy, I got the cookie, I got the praise. It has to be deeper than that. You have to love doing the thing. And you have to have the capacity in you to love doing the thing. That is an adaptive thing, a survival thing, a healthy thing for you to do, because you aren't always going to get the reward. But if you keep doing the thing, sometimes you will, hopefully enough that you can keep going. And that's closer to what Jesus is talking about when he talks about, love your neighbor as yourself. He's not saying so that you get a cookie. He's saying a society in which people have solidarity with one another is a society that's able to tolerate hardship and difficult times better than one that throws everybody under the bus at the first sign of, the Nazis. Going back to Stephen's allusion to fascism. It's to have resilience, to be a species or a culture that can survive, you have to have resilience. And have resilience, your motivation for doing the right thing has to be deeper than an immediate reward. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yes, I'm going to go with Duran Duran out of Barbarella, who wanted to teach people the wisdom of the lash. Earth's last great dictator, as he called himself in Barbarella. But I mean, you think of the British Navy, you know, the cat o' nine tails, you know, the fine tradition that created Australia was the cat o' nine tails. Now, the thing is, people think that beating somebody else with a stick is invariably a bad thing. But if it's a wise taskmaster, better to be hit by a stick and do something really dumb and fall overboard and drown. The stick's only going to give you a bruise. You make a serious error and nature won't be so kind. Sometimes, you know, these medieval communities, you were stuck with people you liked. You were also stuck with people you didn't like. But even the person you didn't like was possibly less dangerous than nature, which would consume you. Even the person you didn't like might give you a bit of food when you're hungry. You know, people have this attitude, you know, just the inner angels of human nature. You know, it's this whole thing with, you know, the left, that you just let people be there and they'll be good, you know. And Hannah Arendt said the opposite, really, didn't she? Well, that was the whole theme. People can act good or bad. It's a question of what works for them. I was at, you know, I had one of our humanist friends giving a talk on Saturday, and I was being very polite, struggling with myself. I'm trying to be more polite these days. But, you know, he's arguing, you know, for the whole point. And you know, he talked about Euphro's dilemma. And I rephrased it for them as they were putting down religion and God. I said, is the good loved by the humanists because it is good? Or is it good because it is loved by the humanists? And suddenly, you know, he looked at it and he was smiling. We're getting on well. Usually we'd sort of cross swords a few times, but I was being polite this time. And he looked at it and then the eyes started going crazy. And it says, of course it is loved by, because it is good. And I'm trying to point out that what we have objectively as good is social custom. I mean, if you're in the wrong village in the Middle Ages, to them, good was burning witches. What do we do with witches? So you just have to be, well, Nazi Germany, what was the good? I mean, I was reading the account of somebody in the death camps who is writing down his diary how personally horrified he is by killing the Jews. But it's all for a good cause.
Yeah, an order is an order.
That's what he literally believed. He found it horrifying that he had to kill people. But he's doing his job for the greater cause. That's the good. So when people talk about this objective good, yeah, you think you got the universal good. Well, I mean, this is where it is. The Christians had a good argument. They've got this all-powerful God. Is it true? Is it false? Don't know. But if there's this all-powerful universal God, then this all-powerful universal God has a very good bid to give you an all-powerful universal good. But when, as Nietzsche pointed out, you've tossed the God out of the boat and you're just left with the beliefs, and you think, as Feuerbach did, all these beliefs were created by humans anyway, so we've got it. And Nietzsche's nodding his head. No, it doesn't sort of work like that. Because, you know, what is the goods? Do we really know what this good that we have? Is it always really good? Or, you know, well, the good used to be, let's go to Africa, beat up the natives and teach them Christianity so they can go to heaven. I'm serving humanity. I'm saving their souls. That's the good. the objective good. So, I mean, when the humanists say we love the good because it is the good, I'm not so sure about that one. The other argument, you know, it's easy for the spiritualists. Oh, yeah, it's good because God has created it that way. But there's a logic in that argument. No, thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, and this is, isn't it? This is the core question that the Greeks pose to us when they say, sorry, Sharon, did you want to?
Oh, I was just going to tell Stephen, great perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen.
Because good, and I don't want to get into this thing, good is variable. And it depends on the culture and the concepts and the dictum governing that society. So good is very variable. And in fact, something that I've always wondered, you know, slaves adopted Christianity. And my father used to tell me that that's an oxymoron, but it did happen. Because slavery was so cruel, and that's what Stephen is alluding to. There was nothing good about it. So how can you adopt a God that is supposed to be so good, but he sanctions you treating people like that?
Yeah.
So
yeah, the Greeks believe it is the difficult existential situation
thank you.
that we're in. That's it in a nutshell. You can figure out what the Martin Skipper butterfly needs, what's good for it, and you can write it up in a page or two. But you can't do that with Homo sapiens. It's very difficult. Donald, would you be willing to have Joe jump in ahead of you in line? He had a comment he wanted to make.
It's going to be 2 seconds. I mean, it literally is just going to be a moment. I mean, but you know, there's one thing you can say it's God, but if you don't believe it's God, then you're just listening to another human being. I mean, so if it's the individual that claims they have God's message that is telling you what to do, it's a human being. So that, I mean, the only distinction there is the humanists are actually saying, no, it is a human being, you know, that as opposed to the, you know, whoever is the messenger. And so, I mean, it's, you know, the whole good conversation is still coming from, you know, whether, you know, it's, my point is that more importantly, you have to authentically believe. If you, whatever it is, you have to truly believe it to be good in order to actually do it
Right.
for the right reasons and for the act in itself.
Right.
If you don't believe it, then you're doing it just to be part of a group.
Yeah, and the difference will come out in dozens of ways, as Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and plenty of others have noted. You know, the difference between authentic Christianity and hypocritical Christianity is huge. When it's empty forms and hypocrisy, even while you're supposedly going through the motions, it still corrupts what you set out to do. Yeah, I mean, you're right about that issue of authenticity. I mean, that's the core of the big break at the end of the Middle Ages. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, Kenneth's having a little fun here. You know, that these philosopher kings have deigned to turn aside from this sublime contemplation of ideal truths to, you know, sort of bestow upon us some understanding of justice. Well, that's, you know, I know how Kenneth feels about Platonism. He kind of, you know, this is a continuing conversation we've had for decades. But you don't have to look for the philosopher king. You can go read the Apology, where Plato, Socrates says there that no argument, and this he's getting ready to, is it that or the Crito? He's getting ready, he's near his death, he's near his end, and he says, no argument has convinced me that has not convinced me that it's not better to suffer evil than to do it, or to suffer injustice than to do it. Now, he's not saying that, well, you know, these philosophers, they're so great that we should just suffer injustice because it doesn't destroy our character, you know, but he is saying that getting that slap on the cheek isn't going to hurt you in a sense. But, you know, the traditional view of Greek morality, we saw it like Cephalus in the beginning of the Republic. Well, hurt your enemies, help your friends. And Socrates really kind of refined that to treat all men justly. Now, if they persist in being your enemy, that means you might slap their cheek pretty hard. That's just. Men that do evil justly receive punishment. And men that persist. But treating a man justly who's done you some injustice also could teach him, oh, I've been tricked. I never understood. Here's a man that treats me better. And I am becoming better because of the way he treats me. So there is room within Platonic justice for the kind of subtleties when we were talking about Jesus and we do this or don't do that or suffer this or suffer that. There's nothing there that says you have to just take it forever from an unjust man. That's not what treating justice is like, or showing men about God either. God might be a pretty rough guy. He was at one time anyway. You know, he's got a little, you know, you read the Old Testament, I would say he has some blood on his hands. But anyway, so this is a little deeper in Platonism than the Philosopher Kings, because Socrates really at several points argues this for everyone, that this is how we ought to behave. I would also like to go back a little to, you know, Stephen sort of list idealism and humanism or whatever it's like some Kantian categories of opposites there.
Dynamism versus rationalism.
Yeah, dynamism versus rationalism. Well, one, I don't really know about dynamism or rationalism, but I'll take whatever you've said there. I'll accept it. But I have some objection in that, at least as we're considering existentialism, and that, you know, existence before being and whatever people want to say, there's nothing there that says in their existence, men can't find ideals or ideas or things that seem more permanent than convention, nomos. I mean, the Greeks at least thought there was something more than nomos. They called it, you know, kataphusei, you know, according to nature. Kenneth in his stuff talks about that organisms all have arche, guiding principles. You can still, in a world of existentialism, not find that everything, or you may not find that everything's just a contingency that or a convention that we have to deal with. Existentialists surely have to exist before they can begin examining human nature. But there's nothing that says everything about human nature that they find from their examination has to be some sort of convention that precludes us not being able to judge the Nazis or the fascist or authoritarians or whatever, that they aren't making something more than violating our conventions. They're doing something truly bad. They are actually harming people because the people are worse off after they are the receivers of whatever actions these people do than they were before. So I think that's enough. I'll go back. But Kenneth, oh, thank God these philosopher kings just, took time out of their busy day to enlighten us about the importance of justice in human affairs.
You hear him laughing, do you?
Oh yeah, I almost said, like, was he just testing to see if I ever read this or was awake or something?
He's poking you, Donald.
I know. Yeah, well, I'm grateful for the philosopher kings, Yeah.
And on that note, we'll we'll wrap up for the week. Hope you all had a good time. I certainly did. And
Thank you. It was very, very good. Thank you.
Thanks as usual. It was wonderful.
Yes.
Yeah.
We'll pick it up next week with the second layer of Q. Oh, eschatology.
Oh yeah, this place, it awakens me from my dogmatic slumbers. It just brings out the Kantian in me.
Oh God. Well, on that cheery note, thank you all for joining us. Take care. Have a great week.